Chapter 11 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dr. Horace's Warning. When London was made acquainted with the verdict, the majority of people were satisfied that justice had been done. Miss Chint's behavior while in the dock, the open sympathy of the Grange servants, the occurrence of the second murder, so similar in all respects to the first, and the evidence of Horace with regard to the anesthetic properties of the sacred herb of Easter Island, went far to enlist the public in favor of the accused girl. Perhaps, also, her youth and brilliant beauty had something to do with the loudly expressed pleasure of those who read in the newspapers that she had been set free. Of course, there were the usual malcontents, who agreed with no one, and wrote to the journals stating that the verdict was wrong. A communication to the Daily Telegraph insisted that Miss Chint must have lied, declaring that she fell senseless while unfastening the window for fresh air. If it had been the case, Captain Jadby would have found her lying near the window, whereas she was discovered in the armchair near the fire, some distance away. But a supporter of the late prisoner replied to this by pointing out that the murderer of Sir Oliver undoubtedly had picked up the girl while she was insensible and placed her in the chair. The first correspondent retorted that Sir Oliver was dead, and his murderer conspicuous by his absence when Miss Chint entered the library, and so could not have shifted her from the floor onto the chair. To this the defending writer wrote that there was no proof of Sir Oliver being dead when Miss Chint entered, as it was apparent that the fumes of the herb had drugged him into insensibility, and therefore the murderer must have entered later to kill the baronet, and remove his niece from the place where she fell, by her own showing, to the chair in which she was discovered by Captain Jadby. And so the war of letter writing went on. And although Mona was free from the danger of hanging, her character was still stained, in the opinion of some people, with the blood of her uncle. Prelice was furious when he read this correspondence, but on the face of it did not see how he could defend Mona, since he had no evidence to bring forward in her favor. On the testimony of the knife it was generally considered that Agstone had murdered his master, and then had come to Alexander Mansions to kill the barrister, but of course both Shepworth and his friend, knowing the true story of how the knife came into Agstone's possession, were by no means certain that the old sailor was guilty. The mystery of Sir Oliver's death was no longer one to the public, as everyone had been misled by the suppression of the evidence dealing with the knife, but it continued to be one to those who had suppressed that same evidence. But of one thing Lord Prelice was certain, namely, that Mona's character would have to be completely cleared by the discovery of the real criminal. With this idea in his mind he went next day to Alexander Mansions, and learned, somewhat to his surprise, that Shepworth was within. Inspector Burge informed him of this at a chance meeting on the stairs, and affably told the constable guarding the door of number 40 that Lord Prelice was to be admitted to see the prisoner. "Not that he is a prisoner," said Burge, nodding. "We are merely detaining Mr. Shepworth until the inquest is held on the body of Agstone." "When does the inquest take place?" asked Prelice, lingering to ask necessary questions. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at the Greyhound Hotel, Kensington. Beyond the fact that the jury will bring in a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown, I don't think that we, the police, that is, my lord, can give any evidence to indicate the assassin of Agstone." "Then why accuse Mr. Shepworth?" "I don't accuse him." "If you don't, why arrest him?" "It is best to be on the safe side," said Burge dryly, "and notwithstanding what Mr. Shepworth may have written to you, my lord, the arrest has not taken place. He is merely detained, pending the inquest." "And under suspicion?" flashed out Prelice loyally. The inspector shrugged his square shoulders. "If you like to put it in that way," he said indifferently. "But it is absurd to suspect Mr. Shepworth," cried Prelice excitedly. "Many people saw him insensible, in the same way that Miss Chint was insensible. If she is guiltless, and a competent jury have acquitted her, Mr. Shepworth also must be innocent. The evidence of Dr. Horace—" "Quite so, my lord," interrupted Burge with a rather bored air. "But all that will be discussed at the inquest. We need not enter into it now, considering we have insufficient premises to go upon. If anyone murdered Agstone, which they certainly did, since no man can stab himself in the back—" "It must have been the lady seen by Mr. Shepworth," finished Prelice. "That might have been a hallucination." "And the moon might be made of cream cheese," reported Prelice heatedly. "It may be," assented Burge gravely. "I know no reason to the contrary, my lord. But this talk leads to nothing, and I am very busy. Go in and see your friend. You will find Dr. Horace with him." "Dr. Horace?" echoed the young man, staring. Inspector Burge nodded. "So you may guess that, when thus permitted to see his friends, Mr. Shepworth is not a legitimate prisoner. By the way," added Burge formally as he took his leave, "I am delighted that Miss Chint has been acquitted." "Of course. She is innocent." "Entirely innocent in my opinion, and very beautiful also. Mr. Shepworth is a lucky man, my lord. Good day." The inspector descended the stairs, leaving Prelice somewhat puzzled. The young man could not quite determine whether Burge believed Shepworth to be innocent or guilty. At one time he said one thing, again he hinted at another. However, it was useless to ponder over the enigma, so Prelice entered the flat, after a word or two with the uniformed Cerberus who guarded the door, and was conducted by a somewhat pale parlor maid to the library. Here he found Dr. Horace, looking more uncivilized than ever, in deep conversation with Ned. The latter sprang up when his friend entered. Shepworth had lost some of his ruddy color, and his eyes had dark circles under them. Otherwise he appeared to be quite composed and not at all like a man accused of a serious crime. And in spite of Burge's protestations, Prelice believed that the inspector did so accuse him, mentally at all events. "You are just in time, Prelice," cried Shepworth, grasping the newcomer's hand warmly. "In addition to the mysteries of these murders, we have another to solve in the person of our friend here." "There's no mystery about me," said Horace gruffly. "I merely advise you to leave matters as they stand." Prelice looked as astonished as Shepworth. "But I say," he cried, "you wanted to take a hand in the game yourself, Horace." "I have taken a hand," retorted the doctor coolly, "and I have won. My aim was to save Miss Chint from being unjustly convicted. For whomsoever murdered Lanwin, I am convinced that she is innocent. As she is now free, and the prevailing opinion seems to be that Agstone is guilty, why stir up muddy water and waken sleeping dogs?" "You forget," said Shepworth rather tartly, "that I have to be cleared myself. Burge says that I am innocent, but the fact that he has practically arrested me proves that he thinks the contrary." Horace, who was smoking his ungainly German pipe, shook his shaggy head vigorously. "When the inquest takes place, you will be discharged without a stain on your character. That being the case, my advice to you is a speedy marriage with Miss Chint, who is also free. Don't bother your head further about these two murders." When Horace mentioned marriage with Mona so pointedly, Prelice darted a side glance at his chum, bearing in mind the hints of Captain Jadby and Lady Sophia. As he expected, Shepworth colored and looked confused. "At present I am not rich enough to marry Mona," he said in a halting way, "and by the burning of the will she loses the property." Horace chuckled silently. "Which goes to Captain Jadby?" Yes, the earlier will comes into force now that the latter one has been destroyed." "In that case," observed Horace, complacently puffing at his pipe, "I should advise her to marry Captain Jadby." Shepworth, still looking uneasy, went to stare out of the window, and it was Prelice who replied, "I'm hanged if she'll do that." "Why not?" inquired the doctor, with a keen glance. "Jadby has the money by Shepworth's showing. He isn't bad looking, and he loves her devotedly. Also, it was Sir Oliver's wish." "Jadby's a caddish ruffian," cried Prelice warmly, and with a sudden access of color. "We don't know where he comes from, or—" "From the South Seas, my old son." "Or who he is," continued Prelice impetuously. "It would be a shame that so delightful a girl should marry a shady buccaneer. Ned, you are engaged to Miss Trent. Why don't you speak?" "There is nothing to say," replied the barrister somewhat coldly. "If Miss Trent will take me, a pauper as I am, I shall only be too charmed to make her my wife." Prelice raised his eyebrows. A conviction was forcing itself upon him that Ned had no real love for the girl. But if that was the case, why had he become engaged to her? Why had he so vigorously defended her of late? Then there was Mrs. Dolly Rover, but Prelice knew nothing about that mysterious lady, as he had not seen her since returning to London. He had half a mind then and there to demand an explanation from Ned, but the presence of Dr. Horace restrained him, and with an afterthought of wisdom, he determined to interview Mrs. Rover herself before coming to an understanding with the barrister. As it was therefore unnecessary to pursue the subject, and as already Horace was asking him mutely why he should take such an interest in an engaged young lady, Prelice changed the subject by an attack on the doctor himself. "I can't understand why you should wish to abandon the search into these cases when you were so keen yesterday to run the show on your own." Horace quite understood the slang of the concluding remark. "I merely quoted a proverb about letting sleeping dogs lie," he said coolly. "Why? Are you afraid for a certain person?" questioned Prelice, meaning Agstone and the listener's relationship with Agstone. "Oh, no," retorted the doctor, quite aware of what Prelice was referring to. "The person you hint at is dead, and every one believes him guilty of the first murder. It doesn't matter who killed him, as Shepworth here is sure to be acquitted. I don't care a damn one way or the other, as you will respect my confidence." "What confidence?" asked the barrister suddenly. "One that I made to Prelice here," said the doctor dryly. Then heaving up his squat figure from the armchair, he waddled towards the door. There he paused and addressed himself to Prelice. "If you go on prying into this matter," he said, with an uplifted finger, "you will be very, very sorry, my son." "What do you mean?" "Gammon and spinach," said Horace, again enigmatic, and hurled himself out of the room, still smoking his unwieldy pipe. The two young men stared at one another. "Is he mad?" asked Shepworth. "Mad like Hamlet, south-southwest," rejoined the other in a vexed tone, "unless he is in league with that Jadby bounder whom he knew in the South Seas. I don't know what he means by backing out." "But surely you don't suspect Jadby?" asked Ned, startled. "Why not? He was at Mrs. Rover's ball." "Nonsense! She doesn't know him." "Remember the jewel robberies," said Prelice dryly. "A great number of people unknown to host or hostess were at that ball." "But Jadby—" Shepworth bit his fingers perplexedly. "You can't suspect him. He came and saw me, and then went away. It was a woman whom Agstone brought in. She must have killed Agstone." Prelice shrugged his shoulders and sauntered about the room. "Perhaps," he remarked carelessly, sauntering about the room. "I certainly have no reason to suspect Jadby, save that he was at the ball." How do you know?" "He was one of the crowd that rushed in to see you insensible, and he wore a domino and mask, as did the rest of them." "Then how did you spot him?" "He unmasked." "That shows his innocence," declared Shepworth quickly, "for if he had come to the ball to slip down and murder Agstone, he would not have revealed himself." "Hmm. Hmm. Perhaps not." Prelice threw himself into a chair. "However, I shall keep an eye on Jadby." "Then you are still searching into the case?" "Into both cases," corrected the other, lighting a cigar. "I want to learn who killed Lanwin, and who murdered Agstone." "Out of friendship for me?" cried Shepworth, grasping his chum's hand. "You are a brick, Dory." Prelice returned the grasp, but blushed a trifle. He knew that love for Mona prompted the desire to search as much as friendship for the man before him. If he could only understand Shepworth's attitude towards the girl and towards Mrs. Rover. Again it was on the tip of his tongue to ask a leading question, but he suppressed the desire, and kept to his earlier resolution to see the lady in the flat overhead. "By the way," said Prelice carelessly, "have you seen Miss Trent?" "No," answered Shepworth rather ruefully. "I wish I could have seen her, but Burge hurried me away from the court to keep me as a kind of state prisoner here. However, Mona wrote me a short note thanking me for all I had done, and said that she was going down to Lanwin Grange. But if it belongs to Jadby—" "The will isn't proved yet," interrupted the barrister quickly, "and until it is, Mr. Mortaban thinks Mona should stop at the Grange." "Mr. Mortaban?" "The late Sir Oliver's lawyer, a kind, clever old chap. He has taken Mona down to the Grange, and Mrs. Blexley, who is devoted to her, will look after the poor girl until I am free to visit her." "You'll go down, of course?" said Prelice nervously. "Oh, yes, as soon as the inquest is over and Burge sets me free. I do not see how I can be arrested. But meanwhile, Dory, you could do me a great favor." Prelice raised his eyes. "What is that?" "Go down at once to Hyde and see Mona." "But I don't know her," said Prelice, taken aback, although his face grew hot and his heart bounded at the idea of meeting this adorable girl, with whom he now knew himself to be in love. "I'll give you a card of introduction. Tell her that I'm all right and will be down as soon as I can." "All right," assented Prelice, feeling a guilty joy in thus yielding to a delightful temptation. "But the case?" "That can look after itself until the inquest is over. Then, when I have seen Mona, and her future is settled by Mortaban, her living and income and all that, I mean, we can look into matters. I am as keen as you are to get at the truth of these two murders, Dory. We can dispense with Horace." "I wish I knew exactly why he backed out," muttered Prelice thoughtfully. "It is so unlike Horace to jib." "Perhaps he has something to do with the matter himself, seeing that he possessed the sacred herb," said Shepworth jocularly. "Nonsense. Horace would kill one man and a dozen men in fair fight, but he's not the chap to stick anyone in the back. By the way, tell me one thing, Ned. This lady who came in with Agstone, and waved the cup under your nose to make you insensible, she wore a green mask, you said?" "Yes, and a green domino also." Prelice nodded. "Did you catch a glimpse of her frock by any chance? Or did your senses fail you?" "They did not fail me too quickly. I did see her frock. It was a white dress with thin lines of red running horizontally across it." "Many lines?" asked Prelice breathlessly. "It seemed to be ruled like a page of music," said Shepworth. "Why, what is the matter?" "Matter?" echoed Prelice, who had risen and was dancing round the room like a schoolboy. "What you say gives me a clue. I saw that dress at the ball. The lady who wore it was scented with tuberoses." "With tuberoses?" "Or with the sacred herb. I must find out who she is." How can you?" "I don't know. I can't say, but if we can find her we may learn if she killed Agstone and why she did it. That discovery will lead to learning who murdered Lanwin. It is the beginning of the end." "Give up the case, indeed!" cried Prelice, exultantly. "Why, it's the only thing that renders life in London bearable." "But do you think that this lady is guilty?" asked Shepworth, doubtfully. "Of course I do. Otherwise, why should she be scented with the perfume of the sacred herb, which has to do with both crimes?" Shepworth shook his head, unable to answer this question. Chapter 12. of the Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Dolly Rover. Shortly after the reference to the unknown lady, Lord Prelice took a hasty leave. There was nothing more to be said, as matters up to date had been threshed out thoroughly between them. Until the inquest had been held on the body of Agstone, and Shepworth's immediate future was decided, no move could be made towards elucidating the mysteries. Moreover, Prelice was mortally afraid lest Shepworth should alter his mind about making him ambassador to Miss Trent at Hyde. Strong-willed as the young man was, when he chose to exercise that same will he could not deny himself the pleasure of being in Mona's company, if only for 10 minutes. Besides, he very much wished to learn if she truly loved Ned, for by this time he felt sure that Ned had no very deep affection for her. In his hurry to catch a train to Hyde, Prelice quite forgot his determination to see Mrs. Rover, and learn how matters stood between her and the barrister. But the powers that direct the actions of men, and the lives that are made by such actions, brought about a meeting with the lady almost immediately. After shaking hands with the pseudo prisoner, Prelice left the flat, to find Mrs. Rover arguing vehemently with the constable posted at the outer door. She wished to enter and see Shepworth. The constable, pursuant to strict orders, was trying to point out that his duty lay in stopping her, a point which Mrs. Rover obstinately refused to see. "I wish to enter," she kept repeating. "It is necessary that I should see Mr. Shepworth, and—" "Will I do instead?" said Prelice, suddenly appearing at the open door. "Dorry!" cried Mrs. Rover, giving him the pet name of his youth. "What are you doing here?" "I am talking to you," said the young man, shaking hands. "But just now I have been chatting with Ned." "Then why can't I chat with him also?" demanded the lady. Prelice shrugged his shoulders. "Ned is allowed to see no one unless Inspector Burge gives permission." "What rubbish! Let me go in." And Mrs. Rover, in a flaming temper, tried to push past the policeman. "You can't, ma'am," he said firmly and respectfully, adding to the pale parlor maid, who still lingered out of sheer curiosity, "Close that door straight away." "I'll report you," cried Mrs. Rover, when she saw the door practically banged in her angry face. "All right, ma'am, but duty is duty." "Constance, Constance," whispered Prelice, touching her arm, "don't make an exhibition of yourself before the servants. The man is only doing his duty. Come upstairs and we can have a chat." "What about?" demanded Mrs. Rover swiftly, and Prelice saw, or thought he saw, a glint of fear in her eyes. "Well," he answered, smiling, "I have not had an opportunity of talking to you since I returned to town, so it is natural that I should wish for a short conversation." Mrs. Rover, who apparently was an extremely obstinate woman, paused irresolutely, looking at the stolid policeman with a battle light in her eyes. But the constable met her gaze firmly, so finding that feminine persistence could do nothing in the face of an official barrier, she turned away, biting her lip. "Come upstairs, Dorry," she said, beginning to ascend. "I can do nothing with that fool." Prelice smiled at this Parthian arrow and slipped a florin into the constable's hand to pacify him for the parting insult. Then he ran up after the lady and reached her on the next landing. "You ought to be pleased, Constance," he said slyly. "You've had the last word." "I should like to have had the last half dozen," she retorted, putting a Yale latch key into the lock. "I think that you have even achieved that," replied Prelice dryly. "It is extraordinary that women never will learn that the law is stronger than sheer temper." "I am not in a temper," snapped Mrs. Rover, sweeping into her flat. "I never was calmer in my life. Never, never, never." "I am quite content to believe that," said her companion acidly, for as Constance Newton, Mrs. Rover had not been noted for imperturbability. It was all the better, in Prelice's opinion, that her temperament should be thus fiery, as he would discover from her rash tongue much that a more cautious and composed woman would withhold. Moreover, Constance and her visitor had been friends for many a long year, witness her calling him Dorry, and she was accustomed to speak frankly to him about her troubles. Had Prelice been in England when the stockbroker was courting the lady, it is doubtful if Constance would ever have become Mrs. Rover, and Prelice strongly suspected that Mr. Rover found Ned Shepworth an inconvenient third in his marriage state. "You are looking very well, Constance," said Prelice, when the two were seated in the drawing room, which was more gorgeous than artistic. "I'm not well, then. I'm nearly worried to death." "So sorry. Tell me all about it." "I'll do nothing of the sort." "I beg your pardon. Let us chat about the weather." "Do you think that I have time to waste in discussing barometers?" She rose impetuously. "Don't know, I'm sure," replied Prelice, keeping his temper admirably. "Well, then, I haven't." "Would it do any good if I gave you a thorough shaking?" "Yes, it would. If Dolly shook me I should respect him, but he lets me lead him the life of a dog, and doesn't even bark, much less bite." "I see you prefer a bulldog to a poodle." "Ned isn't a—" Mrs. Rover stopped in the center of the room, grew red, and could have bitten out her tongue for so incautious a speech. "What rubbish you talk!" she said, trying to smile carelessly. Prelice looked at her gravely. "I hope you are talking rubbish, too." "I wish I were dead and buried," whispered Mrs. Rover, and once more sat down to burst into violent tears. Expert in the handling of the sex, Prelice knew better than to offer a single word of consolation. He lay back in his chair, quietly watching the progress of the storm. Mrs. Rover was going through the usual program of upset woman. She had raged, now she wept, and would shortly be offering an apology for her conduct on the plea of nerves. Constance had certainly grown into a handsome woman. When Prelice had left England 7 years before, she was merely a schoolgirl, very gawky and very awkward. Now she appeared tall, majestic, and beautiful after the voluptuous style of Juno, Queen of Olympus. Her hair and eyes were dark, her features delicate and regular, and her figure was finely formed, even if a trifle inclined to stoutness, as it assuredly was. Prelice had somewhere seen an old print of Catherine II. Of Russia, and it struck him that Mrs. Rover greatly resembled the Empress, although she was undeniably a more lovely woman. It was unfortunate that her face should have been marred by a sullen expression, hinting at a superlatively bad temper. But many people, unobservant as most people are, never noted this defect. They only saw before their ravished eyes a handsome, well-bred, graceful woman, perfectly dressed, and quite able to hold her own in the most exacting society. Yes, Constance had improved greatly, Prelice admitted that, but he wished to find out if she possessed the same beauty of character as of person. From what he had heard and what he had seen, he had grave doubts on this point. "Pray excuse me," said Mrs. Rover, offering the expected social apology in a faint voice. "I'm rather upset. My nerves are out of order. The season has been trying, and then that horrid ball bowled me over, with its robberies and murders, not to speak of Dolly, oh, I don't know what he is." "Do you think it is good taste to discuss your husband with me?" asked Prelice rather tartly. "You are the only true friend I have in the world, Dorry." "Then you have made no acquaintances since I left England 7 years ago, Constance?" "Oh, acquaintances?" she echoed contemptuously, rolling her damp handkerchief into a ball. "I have hundreds of these, but a friend, oh, Dorry, there isn't a single person I'd trust with a shoelace." "He or she would not thank you if you did," replied Prelice, smiling. "A shoelace is not good security for anything." "That's just it," wailed Mrs. Rover, dabbing her red eyes with the handkerchief. "People like one for what they can get out of one. But there isn't a soul to help me. Poor me!" "Won't Ned?" asked her companion very deliberately. Mrs. Rover darted a keen glance at him, and rose to alter the position of her hat in front of the mirror over the fireplace. Prelice knew quite well that she was watching him in the mirror, and carefully smoothed all expression out of his good-humored face. "Ned!" repeated Mrs. Rover, patting her hair back. "Oh, yes, Ned, of course. Do you think they will hang him?" she demanded, wheeling round, rather white, and breathing hard. "Good heavens, no! What put that into your head?" "He isn't allowed to see me. The arrest—" "Ned hasn't been arrested. The fact that he was seen insensible by heaps of people proves his innocence. Burge is simply detaining him as a necessary witness, although I admit that Burge is taking a somewhat high hand in the matter. Don't bother your head about Ned, Constance. He'll soon be free to marry that girl." "Mona Chint!" Mrs. Rover clenched her hands and breathed still harder, while Prelice anxiously watched the effect of his deliberate introduction of the name. "Oh, yes." She went off into a meaningless trill of laughter. "She's free, isn't she? Lucky girl! For I quite believe that she killed her uncle." "Why do you believe that?" demanded Prelice. "Everyone says so." "Everyone does not say so. The majority of people think that the verdict is a just one. I do myself." "Do you know her?" "No. What has that to do with it? You won't like her when you do know her," said Mrs. Rover spitefully. "She's a horrid girl. I never liked her." "That's a pity. You won't be able to visit Ned's wife." "She isn't his wife yet," breathed Mrs. Rover, trying to keep her temper in check. "Perhaps she never will be." "Oh?" Prelice spoke with calculated daring and cruelty. "Do you then think that Mr. Rover will die?" "You coward, you!" she broke off. "What do you mean by that?" "I would rather you explained, Constance." "I have nothing to explain. Did you come here to insult me?" "Of course," replied Prelice, rising. "And now that I have done so, I may as well take my leave." She seized him by the lapels of his coat before he could reach the door. "Don't go, don't go!" she panted. "I do so want a friend. I'll tell you all. You shall know everything." "If it is against your husband, I shan't listen." "You shall. Sit down and hear what I have to say." Prelice was a strong young man, but for the moment her feminine strength prevailed, and he found himself forced into his former seat. "I wouldn't say what I'm going to say to everyone," panted Mrs. Rover, who was very strongly moved. "But even though we have been apart for so many years, I still regard you as my best friend. You and I were boy and girl together. Dorry, you remember." "Ned also," interposed Prelice pointedly. "Yes, yes, of course. I always loved Ned." "Constance, what are you saying?" She rose and beat her hands together. "The truth, the truth. I liked you, Dorry. I always liked you. but I love Ned, and I shall love him until I die." She looked like a tragedy queen. Prelice grew impatient, being a very matter-of-fact young man. "Don't be melodramatic, Constance. Sit down and explain quietly." With that wonderful adaptability of women at which man never ceases to marvel, Mrs. Rover sat down and composed herself with a violent effort. When next she spoke, it was in so cold and icy a tone that Prelice, had his eyes been closed, could have sworn that another person had joined in the dialogue. "You know that my father, the General, was not rich, and that my mother was extravagant. I was the only child, and my parents wished me to make a wealthy marriage, so that their affairs might be put right. That is, my mother wished it, for my father, dear old man, desired me to consult my own heart. I did, and it told me to marry Ned. We were half engaged. My father was willing in spite of his difficulties, but my mother would not consent. Ned was poor, you know. He had only 500 a year of his own, and has not yet made a success at the bar. Then Dolly Rover came along." She stopped and bit her lip, while her hands moved restlessly, as though boxing her husband's ears. "What about, Mr. Rover?" asked Prelice soothingly. Then the natural woman came out, and she rose in a rage. "I hate Dolly like poison!" she cried, pacing up and down the room, twisting her hands together. "He's a horrid, sneaky little cur who—" "Don't abuse your husband, Constance," interrupted Prelice impatiently. "It does no good. You married him of your own free will." "I did nothing of the sort. I married him to save my father from going through the bankruptcy court. It would have broken his heart, dear old father, and he would have died. Dolly knew that I hated him, and that I loved Ned, but he demanded his price, like the mean dog that he is. My mother was on his side, too, and I could not bear to see my father suffer. I parted with Ned and married Dolly. That is, I sold myself, on condition that father's debts were paid. I kept to my part of the bargain." "And didn't your husband keep to his?" "No!" Mrs. Rover stamped violently. "He paid a portion of the debts, enough to avert bankruptcy merely. But he left father the worry, and of that worry father died. My mother has married again, a rich man, so she is happy. And here I am tied to Dolly. Ugh, the name! While my heart is breaking for Ned." "It is a hard case," said Prelice, sorry for the miserable woman. "Still, your self-respect, Constance." "That is right. Preach, preach, preach. So like a man!" she mocked. "I have kept my self-respect, as you term it. I am a good wife to Dolly, although I detest him. I have never said a word against him to anyone, and I wouldn't to you, but that I must speak or suffocate. I can trust you, Dory, and you understand how I feel and what I feel. I love Ned. I want to marry Ned. And here I'm tied to—" Prelice interrupted. "It is hard on you, Constance, I admit," he said. "But you must make the best of it. You say that you lead your husband the life of a dog?" "Of a pet dog, of a poodle. He's so meek and mild and sneaky that I can't respect him. He merely snickers when I grow angry, and chuckles how he got the best of me over the marriage by not paying all father's debts. Oh, what is the use of talking? I love Ned, and Ned loves me." Prelice jumped up. "I can't believe that," he declared, growing angry, "for Ned is engaged to Miss Trent. If he loves you, why is he—" "Don't ask questions," interrupted Mrs. Rover angrily, "or if you must ask them, go to Ned, or better still, to Mona Trent herself." "What can I ask Miss Trent?" demanded Prelice sharply. "It's a very warm weather," mocked Mrs. Rover, "and I think there will be a thunderstorm." The young man looked at her and saw her mouth set obstinately. He knew as well as if she had spoken that there was nothing more to be got out of her for the time being. But what she had said made him all the more determined to see Miss Trent, and learn the truth about the engagement to Shepworth. Meanwhile he took the wind out of Mrs. Rover's sails by falling in with her humor. "It will be a good thing if it does thunder and rain," he remarked, glancing out of the window. "It will clear the air." Mrs. Rover looked as though she would have struck him, but unable to parry his thrust, threw herself sulkily on the sofa. Prelice took up hat and gloves to depart, but halted at the door with premeditated craft. A sudden thought had struck him. "Constance," he said in a natural tone, "I am in love." "Indeed!" she said indifferently. "Yes, with a lady who was at your ball." The remark made her rouse herself, and she sat up with a look of curiosity. "Who is she?" "I want you to tell me that." I could not see her face and very little of her figure, owing to the domino, but she seemed to be so charming when we talked together (this was a lie to gain information) that I quite lost my heart. "It's easy lost," said Mrs. Rover, curling her lip. "The woman may be as ugly as sin under her mask. How was she dressed?" "In a green mask and domino." Mrs. Rover stiffened. "And with a white dress streaked with lines of red velvet. Why do you laugh?" he asked, for Mrs. Rover was trying to suppress her mirth. "Why?" she cried, shaking with merriment. "Because I wore that dress and mask and domino." "You?" Prelice looked horrified. "Yes. Why do you look at me like that?" "You?" Prelice backed to the door in silent horror. He could not trust himself to speak, and finally disappeared, leaving Mrs. Rover petrified with amazement, perhaps with dread. Chapter 13. of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Llanwyn Grange. In the exercise of his profession, a legitimate detective would have waited to question Mrs. Rover. Since she had said so much, he would have forced her to say all, in order to get at the truth as speedily as possible. But Lord Prelice was new to the business, and his emotions were not entirely under control. On leaving Alexander Mansions, he felt that he was in possession of a most dangerous and perilous secret, the publication of which would cause even a greater sensation than that produced by the crimes themselves. The shock of learning that Mrs. Rover was the woman who had been brought by Agstone into number 40 was very great, and quite confused Prelice's usual strong brain. He did not dare to call again on Shepworth, lest he should say too much. It will be seen that Prelice, being an untrained detective, jumped somewhat hastily to a conclusion. Mrs. Rover had admitted that she wore the dress, the mask, and the domino which Shepworth had seen on the unknown lady, but Constance did not know that Ned had so described her appearance, and if she had, would probably not have admitted that she had assumed such a costume at her ball mask. But the mere fact that, even in ignorance of Shepworth's description, she had, as the saying goes, given herself away, should have proved to Lord Prelice that she could not be guilty. Had Mrs. Rover entered number 40 in Agstone's company, and had she struck the blow, she assuredly would not have incriminated herself so unthinkingly. Rather would she have denied that the frock mentioned by Prelice belonged to her. After the first shock, and while Prelice was in the train going to hide, he began to revise his earlier opinion on the above-mentioned grounds. His common sense came to his aid, and told him that, if guilty, Mrs. Rover would not have confessed even to a half-truth. Certainly, had she not done so, her maid, knowing what dress her mistress wore at the ball, might have blurted out the secret. But then, so far as the world knew, no inquiry would have been made about the wearer of that especial frock. Of course, assuming that in a thoughtless moment Mrs. Rover had foolishly confessed the truth, Prelice could find a motive for her behavior in committing the crime. It might be that Agstone wished to kill Ned, and that Mrs. Rover, to save the life of the man she loved, had struck down the sailor unawares. Having committed the deed, she could easily slip back to her own flat, and mingle with the massed crowd. But then again, as Prelice further argued while the train drew near to the coast, Mrs. Rover must have known that in murdering Agstone she was not only securing the freedom of Mona Chent, whom she hated, but also was placing her lover in a dangerous position. Agstone was a necessary witness for the prosecution, whom Shepworth of all men did not wish to see placed in the box. So the supposition would be, were the man found dead in number 40, that Shepworth had killed him to save Mona Chent. As a matter of fact, this is exactly what had taken place, and in saving Ned from the sailor's knife, Mrs. Rover, always presuming that she was guilty, had simply condemned her lover to a death on the scaffold. But that Prelice had been clever enough to admit the crowd of guests so that all might see the barrister's helpless position, it is certain that the man would have been arrested, and probably sentenced to death, since it would have been extraordinarily difficult for him to clear his character in the face of circumstances. Therefore, on these assumptions, for that they were and no more, Prelice after much reflection decided that Mrs. Rover was innocent. Finally the young man recollected that a woman dressed as described by Ned, in the costume which Mrs. Rover confessed to wearing, had passed down the stairs while he was waiting for entrance to number 40, and immediately before the discovery of the crime. She could scarcely have been Mrs. Rover, for as that lady could have easily proved an alibi by returning to her guests and casually unmasking at the right moment, it would have been useless for her to leave the mansions. Of course, the lady, whether Mrs. Rover or a stranger, certainly might have followed Prelice down to the door, knowing that he would be certain to discover the tragedy, and might merely have descended to return to the ballroom overhead when the young man entered Shepworth's flat. But then again, the person in question could not have known that Prelice, masked and unknown, was going to enter number 40, so there would be no reason to track him there. And to conclude, the murderess, if a woman was guilty, must have known that Shepworth, being in a cataleptic state, must have seen and remembered her very peculiar frock. On the whole, Prelice arrived at certain conclusions, by no means inimical to Mrs. Rover, by the time he alighted at Hyde Station. He believed that Constance was innocent for 4 reasons. Firstly, if guilty, she would not have confessed to wearing the dress, since such a confession would necessarily lead to her detection. Secondly, by killing Agstone, she would not only have placed Shepworth in a dangerous position, but by getting rid of an inconvenient witness would have enabled Mona to escape possible condemnation. Thirdly, she would not have followed an unknown man, as Prelice was by reason of his mask and domino, down the stairs with the intention of seeing what took place. Fourth, and lastly, she would not have sought safety in an incriminating flight, as the similarly dressed woman on the stairs apparently had, when she would have been much safer in her own ballroom and amongst her own guests. Only by such a course could she have provided an alibi. No, Mrs. Rover, in spite of her startling admission, was innocent, and the sole conclusion that Prelice could arrive at was the existence of a double, outwardly at all events. He remembered the extraordinary ubiquity of the green domino in the red-streaked white dress, and decided very naturally that there was another woman in the field. But what woman possessed a motive sufficiently strong to urge her to murder Agstone? As Prelice felt quite worn out with arguing in Mrs. Rover's defense, he decided to leave the answering of this new question to the propitious moment when further evidence might reveal the identity of the unknown lady. Meanwhile, on arriving at Hyde, he rested himself at a quiet hotel, and soothed his troubled brain with an hour's necessary sleep. Later on, after an invigorating bath and an excellent dinner, he started to walk towards Lanwin Grange. It was summer, and romance was in the air. At least Prelice scented its presence by some sixth sense. He was going to see the girl he loved, the girl with whom he had not as yet exchanged a single word. Therefore, although past the peacock age, he was particularly attentive to his appearance when assuming his evening clothes. As he strolled inland along the leafy lanes, through the July warmth of the twilight, this somewhat premature wooer looked as comely and well-groomed a swain as any damsel not demanding an Apollo could desire. And it was a great proof of Prelice's infatuation that in looking forward to meeting Mona, he almost forgot that he was merely the emissary of the man to whom the girl was engaged. The whole position was extraordinarily queer. He adored this girl, without being personally acquainted with her. She was affianced to his best friend, and yet he could not be certain if that same best friend really loved the girl herself. Even a Paley royal farce could offer no more fantastic complication than this. Prelice felt that, after running round the wild world in search of the unusual, he had returned to find romance sitting on his doorstep. The way to the family seat of the Lanwins twisted inland and uphill through deep lanes and umbrageous woods. On emerging high up from the belt of trees, Prelice found himself on a wide, unshaded road, snaking over bare downs. For some distance he toiled upward. Then the road mounted a rise to slip down into a cup-shaped hollow brimmed with cultivated woods. In the midst of these he saw an old gray house, seemingly prevented from falling to pieces by the ivy which covered its moldering walls. From the lips of the hollow stretched the rolling, grassy downs, dotted with nibbling sheep, gray in the shadows of the coming night. But it was not yet night, for the sky was filled with a luminous light, all-pervading, yet emanating from no certain point. A breathless peace brooded over the vast treeless uplands, and an even deeper peace seemed to enwrap the ancient mansion. It appeared to be the veritable palace of the Sleeping Beauty, set amidst enchanted woods, and Prelice thrilled with the idea that Beauty herself, awake and unkissed, awaited some prince in the seclusion of her fairy castle. Following the road, which here grew somewhat narrower, Lord Prelice descended into the hollow, passed under the shade of overhanging trees, and came out into a kind of artificial glade, smooth with carefully tended lawns and brilliant with flowers. The grange itself was somewhat sunken in the ground, entirely level with the lawns, and looked like part of the woods themselves, so clothed was it with darkly green ivy. There appeared a weather-worn escutcheon over the great doorway, and lights gleamed from oriel windows in the east, but to the left Prelice saw the three tall French windows opening onto a wide terrace which had been referred to at the trial. These windows appeared quite out of keeping with the Tudor architecture of the mansion, but the visitor eyed them with great interest. It was through one of these windows that Agstone and Jadby had looked, to see the tragedy of Sir Oliver's death, and had that not taken place, Prelice might never have been brought into contact with the most charming girl in the world. His heart beat loudly as he rang the bell. Afterwards, Lord Prelice never could explain clearly how he had first come into the presence of his goddess. In a bewildered manner he waited in the antique hall, after delivering his card to a pompous footman, and in a bewildered manner was led into a long, low, wide drawing room with oriels at the farther end, brilliant with family crests in stained glass. So far as he could recollect, he did not look at the cumbersome Georgian furniture, or at the aggressively modern grand piano, which seemed to be out of place, or at the portraits of cavaliers and their ladies decking the mellow-hued walls, or even at the painted ceiling, or the carpet tinted with rainbow colors subdued by time to grateful sobriety. He had no eyes save for a tall, slim girl, arrayed in a white dress, with a somewhat pale, worn face, who welcomed him in the sweetest of voices and with the most grateful of smiles. "I am glad to see Ned's best friend," she said, and her voice sounded like fairy music in the newcomer's ravished ears, "and to thank him." "To thank me?" muttered Prelice, staring at the lovely face in the mellow lamplight. "I saw you in that terrible court," she said swiftly, "and the way in which you looked at me gave me comfort. Other people, my friends, they call themselves, stared as though I were a wild animal, but you, Lord Prelice," she threw out her hands with an eloquent gesture full of grace, "Ned wrote and told me that you were his friend." "I am here to be yours also," stuttered Prelice, suppressing a wild desire to kneel and worship. "We are friends already. It does not need words to confirm a friendship offered and accepted mutely and with gratitude." Prelice felt more bewildered than ever. Here was a girl so entirely unconventional that she defied the usages of society which prescribed the etiquette for a primary meeting between bachelor and maid. It was marvelously sweet to be thus greeted, but Prelice must have revealed his delighted surprise too clearly, for Miss Chent laughed. "I am afraid that my proffer of unmasked for friendship surprises you," she said smilingly. "But you see, my poor uncle instructed me somewhat in psychology, and I look at the inner rather than the outer." "You said yourself, Miss Chent, that the friendship was asked for in court," said Prelice earnestly, "and it was. As Ned's best friend, I claim to be yours also. I bring a message from Ned." "You shall deliver it presently," said Mona, turning to a stout, white-haired gentleman with a genial face who was standing near the window silently. "Just now you must allow me to introduce Mr. Martaban, another loyal friend. Also," she waved her hand towards a spindle-legged Versailles table as the two men shook hands, "you must have some coffee." Prelice accepted gratefully, as he would have taken poison from the hands of this delightful girl, so long as she served it, as she did the coffee with her own white hands. Martaban took a cup also, and resumed the seat from which he had risen when Prelice entered. Miss Chent pointed out a chair to her visitor and herself reclined on a Louis XIII sofa. Then the three began to talk on immediate and earthly matters, and Prelice was forced to descend from transcendental heights. In that room at that hour and in the presence of such an angel, it seemed desperately hard to abandon romance for reality. But there was no help for it. "Ned's message?" questioned Mona anxiously. "He is all right, and will be down as soon as he can get away," replied the emissary, delivering the exact words of his friend. Then you don't think that he is in danger of being accused of this second crime?" "No, no," interposed Martaban, in a genial but authoritative voice. "I have told you before, and I tell you again, that under the circumstances no one can accuse Mr. Shepworth, and that," added the solicitor, bowing towards the young man, "is due, my lord, to your wise action in admitting the crowd to see Mr. Shepworth insensible." Prelice nodded his thanks. "Ned is perfectly safe," he said quietly. Mona clasped her hands with a thankful gesture. "I am so glad, I am so thankful," she whispered softly. "He has been a dear, good friend, in standing by me when I so sadly needed help." "Oh?" Prelice was rather indignant. "Seeing that he is something more than a friend to you, Miss Trent, he could scarcely fail to lay himself and his life at your feet. It is only what an English gentleman would do to any lady he respected, much less loved." Mona colored, and turned aside her face, rather embarrassed by the impetuous outbreak of her lover's friend. "Both English gentlemen and English ladies held aloof when I was in danger," she said simply, "so you can understand how much I prize the friendship both of Ned and of Mr. Martaban here, seeing that they never believed that I was guilty." "No one could believe that," cried Prelice, still impetuous, and throwing his usual discretion to the winds. "The moment I set eyes on your face I knew that you were innocent." Miss Trent colored again, and rather retreated from the confidential attitude she had assumed. Prelice was going ahead too fast, and her womanly nature, in spite of occult training, was taking alarm. "I must say that, seeing you did not know me, the belief was somewhat rash," she rejoined coldly. "However, I thank you." "And you will allow me to help you?" asked Prelice eagerly but timidly. "Help Miss Trent?" said the lawyer, looking keenly at the young man's glowing face. "In what way?" Prelice laid down his cup, crossed his legs, and delivered himself of his opinion. It was just as well that both Mona and Martaban should learn of his determination to enter into their lives. "Everyone is delighted, with few exceptions," he said somewhat incoherently to the girl, "that you have been acquitted, but some insist that you must be guilty. Forgive me for inflicting pain," he added rapidly, "but it is necessary so that you may entirely understand me. You are safe from the law, Miss Trent, but with some idiots your character is not yet clear. Also, Ned, in spite of the absurdity of the thing, may be accused of making away with Steve Agstone in your interests. In order to set everything right, it is necessary for us to make certain who killed your uncle and who killed the sailor." "But Agstone killed Sir Oliver," said Martaban quickly. "The evidence of the paper cutter which—" "Quite so, quite so," interrupted Lord Prelice hurriedly, and skating quickly over this thin ice. "But we can't prove Agstone's guilt beyond all doubt without further evidence. For Miss Trent's sake, the truth, whatever it may be, must be made public." "And what do you think is the truth?" demanded Martaban, puzzled. Prelice, bearing Miss Rover in mind, shuffled again. "I am not prepared to give an opinion offhand," he replied politely. "But what I wish you and Miss Trent to understand is, that Ned Shepworth has accepted my services towards hunting down the author or authors of this double crime. I wish Miss Trent, if she will, to accept them also." "Willingly and with gratitude," said Mona, extending her slim hand. Prelice contrived to press it in a friendly way and not kiss it, as he felt strongly inclined to do, but the effort was great. "Then we can go ahead," he said easily. "And as I am now admitted to the inner circle, as it were, I should like to know exactly how matters stand. About you, Miss Chint, for instance. Do you remain here?" The girl flushed and glanced, rather embarrassed at her lawyer. "Yes," replied the latter. "Captain Jadby, who undoubtedly inherits, now that the second will has been destroyed, has made no move towards assuming possession of his property. Moreover, there are certain legal formalities to be gone through before he can become the legitimate master of the Grange. Until everything is straight, I suggest that Miss Chint remains in her home." "It is not my home, but Captain Jadby's," answered the girl, coloring painfully. "I would much rather go away. But," she added piteously, yet with a proud effort of self-restraint, "I have nowhere to go to. Uncle Oliver has disinherited me, and my parents died insolvent. If I leave the Grange I go into the world penniless and alone." Prelice winced at the picture she drew. "There is always Ned," he remarked lamely. Miss Chint shot a swift glance at his distressed face, and answered coldly in his own words: "Yes, there is always Ned." The young man felt more puzzled than ever. Her voice did not sound like that of a girl in love, and as he had gathered from Constance, the man Mona was engaged to had not given her his heart. But if this was the case, and it was beginning to appear obvious, why had the two agreed to marry? Prelice did not know what to say, so Miss Chint, seeing his embarrassment, explained in a somewhat embarrassed fashion herself. "Ned is poor," she remarked with deliberate self-control. "He has his way to make in the world. It would never do for me to burden him with a pauper wife." "Two are stronger than one, Miss Chint. There is strength in unity." "Not in this case," she retorted, and quietly dismissed the subject. "Will you come to my house, my dear?" said Mordaunt, who seemed to be devoted to his luckless client. "My wife will be glad to have you." "So will Aunt Sophia," interposed Prelice quickly, and struck with a brilliant idea. "You know my aunt, Miss Chint, Lady Sophia Harkin. She is a friend of yours." "Save yourself, Mr. Mordaunt, and Ned. I have had no friend since I was put on my trial for murder," said Mona in a level voice. "I decline to trouble any person until my innocence is proved." "It has been proved at the trial," said Prelice, and Mr. Mordaunt echoed the speech. "Legally, but not socially," she rejoined, rising. "I accept your services, Lord Prelice. Learn who killed my uncle and who stabbed poor Agstone, and earn," she faltered, "and earn my gratitude." Prelice looked disappointed. Yet what else could the girl say? Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Blexley's opinion. Despite the threatening clouds on the horizon, which hinted at coming trouble, the days passed very quietly at the Grange. As an elderly male chaperon, Mr. Mordaunt remained to look after his client, and the very respectable Mrs. Blexley was also useful in this necessary capacity. Prelice, unable to tear himself away from the too dangerous society of Mona, and dangerous it was, considering his feelings and her engagement to Ned, lingered at the Hyde Hotel. Shepworth, strange to say, did not put in an appearance. "It's odd," remarked Prelice, when strolling over the lawns on the third day of his arrival. "It's odd that Ned doesn't come down." He put the observation in the form of a query, and so Mona, who strolled beside him, was forced to reply. But she did so unwillingly and as briefly as was possible. "Very odd," she said indifferently. Lord Prelice cast a puzzled side glance at her beautiful face, which looked ethereal and rosy under a red sunshade. Even as yet he could not understand what were her feelings towards his friend. And as he was more in love than ever, the situation was perplexing from its very vagueness. In sheer desperation he tried to make her talk of Ned, which she did very rarely, by continuing the topic. "Ned," said the young man, eyeing the trees, the lawns, the sky, and the house with a fine affectation of indifference, "Ned has been acquitted at the inquest, and the jury gave a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown in the orthodox style. Agstone has been buried, and here am I waiting for an interview with Ned to settle some course of action towards elucidating these criminal problems. Yet he has not come down, and has not even replied to my letter." Miss Chint shifted her sunshade from one shoulder to the other. "I expect he'll come down when he is ready," said she calmly. "Oh, Jerusalem! Excuse the swear word, Miss Chint, but if I were Ned I should have come here ages ago." "You did, Lord Prelice. But if you are so anxious to interview Ned, and I quite admit the necessity, why not go up to London?" Her companion wiggled uneasily and searched his brains for an excuse to remain in his uncomfortable paradise. "Well, you see, that is, my dear young lady, I am, to put it plainly, my aunt, you know Lady Sophia, is coming to Folkestone." "She arrived there last night, Lord Prelice." "Eh? What? You don't say so?" Mona laughed, and the young man was glad to hear her laugh. She gave way rarely to merriment during the undecided present. "Why did you write about me to Lady Sophia?" asked the girl gently. "I?" Prelice was quite prepared to lie, but decided not to when he saw the expression of her face. "Well, you see, that is, you understand, that an aunt is an aunt." "I never thought that she was an uncle." "Course not, but there, you see, my aunt expected me to write, and I have written. You needn't have made me the subject matter of your letter." "Who said that I did?" asked Prelice, growing scarlet. "Lady Sophia herself. I received a note from her this morning, and considering my position, a very kind note. It seems that you wrote asking her to stand by me, and she has come to Folkestone to do so." "Loud cheers!" cried Prelice shamelessly. "I always thought that Aunt Sophia was a brick." "She never believed you were guilty, you know," he went on confusedly. "Said all manner of nice things about you to me whenever we met. Now she'll take you under her wing and make things hot for any society fool that dares to say a word against you." "Why do you do this for me, Lord Prelice?" asked Mona in a rather faltering tone, and averting her too speaking face. "I am, that is, well, Ned's friend, you know." "Oh." Mona's voice became steady, and she turned to look at him squarely. "So you enlist your aunt on my behalf for Ned's sake." Was there ever such a perplexing girl? A moment ago and she seemed pleased at being championed by Lady Sophia. Now her looks and her voice were cold. Prelice, in sheer desperation, blurted out the truth in a blundering manner. "A little bit for my own sake also." "I am glad of that." "Are you?" This time it was the young man's voice which became unsteady, for he did not know whether he was on his head or his heels. "That's all right." A sentiment of honor towards the absent Shepworth, who would not look after his own interests, made him end thus lamely. Mona laughed again, and was enigmatic as the Sphinx. "It is extremely good of you, Lord Prelice," she went on in a guarded manner, Lady Sophia can help me greatly to recover my position in society." "You have never lost it," blurted out Prelice crossly. "I did lose it, and I have lost it," she answered sadly, "and I shall never recover it entirely until the murderer of my uncle is discovered. Lady Sophia, who really likes me—" "Loves you, loves you!" "No, no, she likes me. Let us say that she has an affection for me. That is a greatly to be appreciated state of mind for one woman to be in towards another." "That's rather a German sentence, isn't it?" "I don't know what you mean," muttered Prelice, beginning to find out that, after all his experience in the four quarters of the globe, he was but a neophyte where women were concerned. "I mean that Lady Sophia's liking or affection for me will do a great deal to rehabilitate me, but that the punishment of Uncle Oliver's assassin will do more, and your marriage with Ned will do most of all." Mona mocked him. "Marriage covers a multitude of sins, doesn't it?" Prelice clutched his head, but his hair was too close cropped for him to grip. "I am to be best man," he said feebly, and found a delight in torturing himself. "Oh, has Ned selected you for that post?" "He did, when we were at Eton." "I see. Then he was engaged when at Eton. How precocious!" The young man groaned, and glanced at her despairingly, quite unable to understand her moods. Lately she had been sad, now her eyes were dancing with merriment. "I am glad you are happy," he said in a surly tone, for this mystery of her engagement tortured him. "I am," she assented swiftly, "and for 3 reasons." "May I hear them?" "Certainly. In the first place, you and Ned will find out who killed my uncle and poor old Steve, so as to clear my character. In the second place, Lady Sophia is coming over to-day, and thus begins the necessary whitewashing for me to re-enter the world. And in the third place," she ended seriously, "throughout all this trouble I have had a firm conviction that God would help me. He has helped me by saving my life from a legal death, and He will help me to clear my character. Some day, perhaps in the near future, there won't be a single stain on my name. Now don't speak," she held up her hand. "You are about to say that there is not a stain now, but there is. To remove it, I trust in God first and in you second." "What about Ned?" asked Prelice restlessly. "Oh, in Ned also," she rejoined, and looked at him quietly. As he made no observation, and he could not out of sheer perplexity, she turned on her Louis Quatorze heel. "I am going in to get ready for the visit of Lady Sophia," she said abruptly. Prelice watched the red sunshade vanish into the house, then dug his stick into the turf, and swore volubly. He had a considerable command of language in this respect, but rarely exercised his vocabulary. On this occasion he did, since ordinary words failed to soothe him. And even as it was, swearing did little good, so Prelice started to walk violently and aimlessly, only desirous of restoring his temper to its usual state of cynical calm by abnormal exercise. He could not make Mona, as he called her mentally, out in any way whatsoever. She was certainly engaged to Ned, and yet she spoke of him quite unemotionally, as she would have done of—well, not of an acquaintance perhaps, but of a friend. She could not possibly love him, and if she did not, should certainly not be engaged to him. Ned had no money and no position, so she assuredly could not be seeking to better herself by the marriage. Certainly gratitude might induce her to become his wife, since he had stood by her, but then, and here Prelice swore again, she had been engaged to him some time before the death of Sir Oliver, and when no gratitude could possibly have entered into her acceptance. And if she was merely grateful, Ned would not marry her on that account, especially since, on the authority of Mrs. Rover, he loved another woman. For the third time Prelice swore over the problem, and determined to throw all delicacy to the winds, so far as Shepworth was concerned. The moment Ned arrived at the Grange he would ask him plainly what he meant, and what she meant, and what the whole infernal complication meant. It was quite impossible that a young aristocrat with a large income and a healthy frame and a loving heart should sit on thorns any longer. Blankety blank blank, raged Prelice, and looked up on hearing an exclamation of horror at his elbow. His aimless walk had led him to the kitchen garden and to a bed of pot herbs, which Mrs. Blexley was laboriously picking. Being stout, and like Hamlet scant of breath, the housekeeper wheezed like a creaky wheel as she stooped to gather some sage and thyme. But she retained enough breath to cry out with horror when hearing this handsome young gentleman swearing, as she afterwards described it, like the late Mr. Blexley, who had been a skipper of renown in the way of bad language. "I beg your pardon," said Prelice, showing his white teeth, in a smile which won Mrs. Blexley's heart. "I'm a little put out. Didn't know any lady was within earshot." "Bless you, my lord, I'm not a lady, and never laid claim to be one. So swearing, though not proper, don't worrit me overmuch. It calls back old times, sir." "Really? Did you swear yourself?" "Me?" Mrs. Blexley looked indignant. "Why, I belong to the United Inhabitants of the Celestial Regions." "What?" "It's my religion," said Mrs. Blexley simply. "What you might call my sect, my lord. There's very few of us, but we all go to heaven." "There's nothing like being certain of your destination," said Prelice dryly, and was about to move on when the housekeeper stopped him. "Your pardon, my lord, but I've been trying to catch your eyes ever since you came here, but never managed it till now. In a kitchen garden, too," ended Mrs. Blexley mournfully, "which don't seem to be the place for a lord of high degree to speak in." "It suited him to swear in it, however," murmured Prelice frivolously, then added in louder tones, "What do you wish to speak to me about?" "Not about him that is gone," remarked Mrs. Blexley, referring to her lost spouse, "though his language, begging your lordship's pardon, was as like yours as bean pods, and because of such talk he'll never come back, never. Them that has him will keep him." "Indeed! Are they, whomsoever they may be, fond of him?" "I don't think so, my lord. You see, he's dead, my lord." Prelice put up his hand to swirl his mustache and hide a smile. "Then you think that—" "I'm sorry for Blexley," interrupted the housekeeper firmly, "but he didn't belong to the United Inhabitants of Celestial Regions, so he—" She pointed stealthily downward. "Let us hope it is not so bad as that," said Prelice, choking with suppressed laughter. "You wish to speak to me?" he repeated politely. "To catch your lordship's eyes, as it were." "That has been accomplished. What next?" Mrs. Blexley groaned and made an effort. "It's about Miss Mona." The young man's merriment died away, and he looked keenly at the red-faced, shapeless old woman. "What's that?" he demanded, in the imperious tone which formerly he had used towards recalcitrant soldiers. Mrs. Blexley, being timid, dropped with a thud onto the sage and thyme, and placed a podgy hand on her ample breast, gasping like a fish out of water. "The heart, my lord. Mother's side. It ain't strong. If your lordship would speak less like a gun going off—" "Certainly," interrupted Prelice in his most silky tones. "What have you to tell me about Miss Mona?" "It ain't about her exactly, my lord, but there's the will, you know, and that Madame Epengrave, as she called herself, though I don't believe it is her name, for all her airs and graces, and she nearly as old as me, and is stout too, for all her tight lacing." Prelice, leaning against the mellow brick wall where the nectarines grew, stared at the fat woman, who was still prostrate amidst the herbs. "If you knew of such things, Mrs. Blexley, why didn't you explain in court?" "Because I don't believe in courts, or in them as is in courts," said Mrs. Blexley, fanning herself with a pink sunbonnet. "They got me to give what they called evidence, and say things against my dear pretty Miss Mona. I nursed her, sir. I was born in the Grange, and have served the Landwins all my life. When Mrs. Chint went away with her husband, I followed, and when she and him died, I came back here with Miss Mona, as Sir Oliver wished, to be the housekeeper." Prelice nodded sympathetically. "I know that you are devoted to Miss Mona," he said, approving of this devotion. "You are too, my lord, ain't you?" asked the old woman pointedly. The young man grew as red as the brick wall against which he was leaning, but Mrs. Blexley, seeing this sign of anger, went on hastily. "I don't mean boldness, my lord, indeed I don't, but Miss Mona does need a friend sadly, my lord, and she tells me that you are one." "I am," said Prelice firmly and flushing again, "and I am glad that she spoke thus of me. But about this Madame Marie Epengrave. I never liked her, my lord. An oily flatterer she was, with a gimlet eye and a buttery tongue. She was always trying to get the better of Sir Oliver, and gave him that nasty thing that made the smoke." Prelice naturally looked startled. "Why, Sir Oliver brought the herb from Easter Island himself. At least I fancy he did." "I don't, my lord, and what's more, he didn't. I went into the library to ask master what he'd have for dinner, and Madame Epengrave, if that is her name, the old bag of rags, was showing master a lot of dry stems and purple leaves, and talking about trances and such like rubbish. That was just a week before Sir Oliver's death." "What do you make of that, Mrs. Blexley?" asked Prelice thoughtfully. "I don't make anything of it, sir. But it was strange that the nasty smoky weeds she gave master should bring about his death." "Madame Marie had no reason to wish Sir Oliver dead?" "Oh, no, my lord. Why, she lost a good friend in him, and often must have desired him to be alive and kicking. All the same, sir, she gave him them withered leaves, and through them master came by his end." Prelice nodded absently. He required time to think over the matter, and turned away to be alone. Then a thought struck him, and he returned to the housekeeper. "What about the will?" he demanded. "It wasn't burnt." "You must be mistaken. The court—" "Much them lawyers knew about it," cried Mrs. Blexley, struggling to her feet. "I never said it to them, because they said as it would help Miss Mona to get out of their nasty clutches if the will was proved to be burnt. So I said what I was told, for Miss Mona's sake. But Sir Oliver was writing out another will." "How do you know?" asked Prelice sharply and much disturbed. "I saw him writing it," said Mrs. Blexley firmly. "It was never signed, to my knowledge. But you can take my word for it, my lord, that the unsigned will was burnt, and that Miss Mona is entitled by the other to the property." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jadby plays a card. Mrs. Blexley's communications certainly afforded Lord Prelice ample food for reflection. What she had said about Madame Marie, as the young man mentally termed her, implied that the fortune teller was somehow implicated in the tragedy of Sir Oliver's death. Yet he had been a good friend to the lady, and by his death she lost a valuable client. It was impossible to think that she had killed the baronet herself, or had been a consenting party to his death. But undoubtedly, according to Mrs. Blexley's firm asseveration, she had given Lanywyn the roots and leaves of the sacred herb, and from using these in the prescribed way to induce a trance, Sir Oliver had been rendered helpless. Had he not been chained hand and foot by the fumes of the herb, he could not have been killed, as, in spite of his lost leg, he was no despicable antagonist. The herb, therefore, was the main factor in the tragedy, and Madame Marie had placed the same in the man's hands. Of course, it was just possible that someone, name unknown, had found Sir Oliver helpless, and so had taken the opportunity to kill him. Madame Marie may have discovered the guilty person, and, to recompense her for the loss of a wealthy friend, had been bribed by the same person to silence. This pointed to the guilt of Captain Jadby, who might have been anxious to get rid of the baronet, so as to enter into his heritage. But the assertion of the housekeeper about the new unsigned will went far to show that the sailor was innocent. Captain Jadby assuredly would have destroyed the will which gave the property to Mona, and not an unsigned document which mattered nothing to him. Much puzzled by the new aspect of the case, Prelice sought out Mr. Mordaunt, and related what he had heard in the kitchen garden. The solicitor at first scoffed at the idea of the unsigned will being destroyed, but later cautiously ventured the remark that there might be something in it. "Though, mind you," he remarked thoughtfully, "Mrs. Blexley does not prove her case, as we say in legal circles. She states that Sir Oliver made a new will in his own handwriting, but she cannot prove that this was the particular will which was burnt." "But Sir Oliver's handwriting would be recognized," urged Prelice. "It was," replied Mordaunt tersely. "The will leaving the property to Miss Trent was in my late client's handwriting also. He always preferred to write out his own testaments." "To draw them up, you mean?" "Not in this especial instance, my lord. The will leaving all to Captain Jadby, and made in the South Seas years ago, is a personal document, since I have seen it. The unsigned will also was personal, as so far as I know Sir Oliver did not employ any lawyer to draw it up. But I drew out the document by which Miss Trent inherited, and Sir Oliver copied it himself, and had it signed by Mrs. Blexley and Agstone. So you see that we can't actually say which will was burnt, as there is not sufficient remaining of the document. From some of the scraps found, which alluded to Miss Trent as my dear niece, it would seem that the will in her favor must have been destroyed, since Sir Oliver, when angered, would not have spoken kindly of her in the document alluded to by Mrs. Blexley." Prelice nodded absently. "I presume that the new will would also have been signed by Mrs. Blexley and Agstone as witnesses." "I think so, since Sir Oliver trusted both, but according to the housekeeper the will was not witnessed. For all we know, it may not even have been signed." "Mrs. Blexley says that it wasn't." "I think she is right," said Mordaunt thoughtfully, "since the testator has to sign in the presence of the witnesses, and Mrs. Blexley would probably have been one." "What about Captain Jadby?" "He was absent on many occasions, and had he signed as a witness, he would not have benefited." "Madame Marie Eppingrave?" "Hum." Mordaunt considered. "She and Agstone might have signed, certainly, but in that case she would have come forward to state to whom the new will left the property. It could not have been Jadby, since the old will held good, if the second was destroyed." "Madame Marie may have been bribed by Jadby to hold her tongue about the third will. so that the first could stand. Which points to the fact that the second must have been destroyed, yet Mrs. Blexley says that it was not." "I agree," admitted Prelice, "but as you say, she does not prove her case." Mortabon nodded. "The sole way in which the case can be proved is by the production of the second will." "Or of the third," remarked Prelice quietly. "The assassin of Sir Oliver burnt one will, we know not which, and holds the other. He will produce it when he is ready." "And so lay himself open to arrest," ended Mortabon neatly. He paused and went on deliberately. "I advise a waiting game." "A waiting game?" Mortabon nodded. "Let the other side move first." "Do you mean Captain Jadby?" asked Prelice abruptly. "And this unknown assassin, who holds one of the last two wills. Jadby, we know, retains the first, which gives the property to him. He will probably come down to insist upon his rights. I shall refuse to let him have the Grange or the income until the other wills are proved to be destroyed, or at least until he proves that the burnt will is the one giving the property to Miss Trent." "That was proved at the trial." "Quite so. But Mrs. Blexley's story requires that the case should be reopened." "Not for the trial of Miss Trent!" cried Prelice in alarm. Mortabon laughed heartily. "You can make yourself easy on that score, my lord. No one can be tried twice for the same offense." "Well, I agree with you that it is best to wait and see what Jadby does, and then we can checkmate him, as you suggest. Meanwhile, I shall go to London, and call on Madame Marie in New Bond Street. She may know of something likely to elucidate the mystery of the Lanwin Grange crime." "If she does," said Mortabon, with a chuckle, "she certainly will not speak out. A clever woman, Madame Marie." "I can deal with clever women," said Prelice, rather conceitedly. "Deal with Miss Trent, then," finished the lawyer, and the conversation ended for the time being. It was all very well for Mortabon to suggest dealing with Mona, but that young lady was much too feminine for Prelice to tackle. He could make nothing of her. Sometimes she was kindness itself to him, and then she would hold him at arm's length with freezing politeness. Even as yet he could not determine her relations to Ned, otherwise than that an official engagement existed. She gave him no chance of learning the exact truth. When he praised Ned she would assent cordially to the most enthusiastic eulogiums, and yet when he hinted, and being in love, he could not help hinting, that Ned did not behave as a lover should, she entirely agreed. In desperation he would have spoken to her about Constance Rover, but a feeling of loyalty to his absent friend prevented his doing this. Once or twice Prelice determined to leave for London, and wash his hands of all these mysteries, of which Miss Trent was not the least. But he was so deeply in love that, awkward as the position was, he could not tear himself away. Yet, like a true gentleman, Prelice never revealed by word or deed, or even look, that he was at Mona's feet. It was with a feeling of relief that Prelice came one day to the Grange, and found Lady Sophia officially established as Mona's friend. All day long the young man had been walking off his feelings on the downs, trying by violent exercise to calm his agitated nerves. He tore along at top speed for miles, cursing himself for a fool in submitting to be lured by a will-o'-wisp, since, seeing how matters stood between Mona and Ned, he could not hope to make the girl Lady Prelice. But however far he went, the lodestone of the Grange, magnetized by Miss Trent's mere presence, always drew him back to her dainty feet, there to sigh hopelessly for the moon. On this occasion he arrived back to afternoon tea, and was greeted effusively in the drawing-room by his aunt. "Though I can't say that you look well, Prelice," said Lady Sophia, putting up her lorgnette. "What have you been doing with yourself? Late hours and indigestible suppers, no doubt." "Ask Miss Chint," replied Prelice, somewhat sulkily. "She knows what a rake I am." Mona, who was presiding over a well-provided tea-table, glanced at the dark circles under the young man's eyes, at his lack of color, and noted his cross looks. The survey, for some reason, appeared to give her a large amount of satisfaction. "I don't know Lord Prelice's character," she observed demurely. "He's a dormouse, always asleep," said Lady Sophia, sipping her tea. "So Ned told me, and his nickname also. But he's a very energetic dormouse, surely, in exploring the world as he has done." It would be much better if he stayed at home and married." Prelice could not stand this observation in Mona's presence. "That is entirely a personal matter, Aunt Sophia," he snapped. "Not at all," answered the lady coolly. "As you are the head of the house, its members should have some say in your marriage. Unless you marry a nice girl, I shan't call on her." "Have some more tea, Lord Prelice," said Mona, sorry to see how very annoyed he was, yet secretly pleased. Heaven knows for what reason. "Thank you." He passed his cup. "I am glad to see you, Aunt Sophia, and surprised," he ended with emphasis. Lady Sophia put up her lorgnette again. "One is always surprised to find virtue in unexpected places," she remarked coolly. "I plagiarized that from Moliere, my dear. Yes, I am virtuous, coming over into these wilds on a hot day, and I want the reward of my virtue." "What reward do you want?" asked Prelice, gruffly. "The right to look after this dear girl." Lady Sophia patted Mona's arm. "I propose that she shall come abroad with me for a few months. Then next year we can return, and I can present her again at court. I never believed the rubbish that people talked, my sweetest Mona, so you can safely trust yourself under my wing." "I shall be delighted," said Mona, giving the elder lady's arm a little affectionate squeeze. "But don't you think I ought to remain here until the truth is found out?" "You silly child! The truth has positively been shouted from the housetops. Everyone knows that you are innocent. Not," added Lady Sophia in her usual inconsequent fashion, "that I should blame you if you were guilty. I never liked Sir Oliver." "He was very kind to me," said Mona impetuously. "He meant well." "That condemns him. People one doesn't like always mean well. However, he's dead, so we'll say no more about him. But you'll come to Germany with me, my dear. I'm going to some I can't tell you the name exactly. It's too long and sounds too much like swearing. But it's a new bad that has to do with the new disease." "And have you got the new disease, Aunt Sophia?" "I never was healthier in my life, my dear boy. But there's a cave near this bad, with bones and skulls of the Stone Age. I want to see what like the poor, dear things were in those happy times." "They won't look pretty as merely bones," said Prelice dryly. "Perhaps not. Only dogs like bones. But I dare say there will be some dear little axes with which they cut off the heads of animals that lived before the flood. And beads, too, perhaps. Fancy beads. It brings the poor, dear things so near to us to think they wore beads." While Lady Sophia rattled on thus, talking about everyone and everything to set Mona at her ease, the girl herself was listening. "I hear a fly!" she said, starting to her feet expectantly. "Where?" asked Lady Sophia, looking up at the ceiling. "What sharp ears you must have, child! Hark!" Miss Chint walked to the drawing-room door, opened it, and passed through. A moment later they heard her voice raised in joyful welcome, and Prelice tried hard to suppress his jealousy. He did not need Lady Sophia to tell him that it was that Shepworth man. All the same, he contrived to be fairly amiable when Ned entered with greetings. "How do you do, Lady Sophia? Dorry, I am so glad to see you. What a hot day it has been." "Thank you, Mona. I shall be glad to have a cup of tea." Prelice stared as Ned sat down in a comfortable chair near Miss Chint, for he could not understand Shepworth, who had so lately escaped peril, chatting in this silly fashion. The barrister did not look well either, as his face was pale and his eyes sunken. "I expected you down here before," growled Prelice after a pause. "I could not get down," rattled on Ned, stirring his tea. "Another lump of sugar, please, Mona." "There was much to do, but now that Agstone has been buried and my character cleared, I have come down to circumvent our friend Captain Jadby." Mona started nervously. "Oh, Ned, is there anything wrong?" "Not at present, but Jadby will try and put things wrong. He will be here in a quarter of an hour." "Here?" Mona rose in dismay. "Are you sure?" Shepworth nodded and cast a hasty glance at Prelice. "He came to me yesterday and said that he was coming down to see you for a certain purpose. As Prelice is here, and I know very well what Jadby wants to say, I thought it best to come down too. By watching at the station, I found what train he was going by, and nipped in also. At Hyde I secured the only fly, and so have gotten ahead of him." Shepworth glanced at his watch. "He'll soon be here, and then—" He paused. "And then?" queried Lady Sophia, astonished. "Bless me, Mr. Shepworth, what then? How mysterious you are! You surprise me." "Captain Jadby will surprise you more," rejoined Shepworth dryly. "And so I am glad that you are here, Dorry." "Why?" demanded that young gentleman, who was as astonished as his aunt. Shepworth merely nodded mysteriously, and whispered to Mona, who nodded in reply with very bright eyes, and with another glance at the puzzled Prelice. He could not understand, even in the presence of the engaged couple, if they really were in love. Shepworth was certainly attentive, and Mona was extremely amiable, but there was something wanting in their behavior. They had not kissed, for one thing, as engaged lovers surely would do, but perhaps that sign of future marriage had taken place in the hall. Lady Sophia, also puzzled, would have asked questions which her more diffident nephew was afraid to put, but that the footman brought in a card. "Captain Jadby," said Mona, reading the same. "Ned, must I see him?" "It will be as well," rejoined Shepworth significantly, and in the presence of Martaban. "He has gone out on a walk, and won't be back for some time," explained the girl nervously. "But I feel safe with you and Lord Prelice." "Why with me?" Prelice asked, when the footman departed to usher in the South Sea sailor. "You were always so kind," she observed in a low voice, and cast down her eyes, blushing scarlet, much to Prelice's amazement. He really did not know what to make of all this. But Mona's sudden color ebbed from her cheeks when Captain Jadby entered, for she appeared to be rather afraid of the buccaneer. Jadby, halting and bowing on the threshold, did look rather lawless in spite of his civilized flannel garb. He had arrayed himself in white and wore a scarlet cummerbund and a scarlet tie. These touches, of too vivid color added to his smooth dark face with fiery black eyes and curly black hair, and general hint at foreign blood, bespoke him the buccaneer from the fringes of the empire. His manners also left something to be desired, for after bowing to Lady Sophia and Miss Trent, and greeting Prelice with a sullen nod, he turned towards Shepworth. Then his eyes flashed and his mouth grew hard. "You have stolen a march on me," he declared, coming forward. "As you see," replied Shepworth very coolly, "after what you told me yesterday, it was necessary." "I wonder that you are not afraid to come," said Jadby, sneering viciously. "Why should Mr. Shepworth be afraid?" demanded Mona, catching at Lady Sophia's hand to keep up her courage. "Ask him," snarled the captain, posing picturesquely. "Why should you be afraid?" Mona reiterated, turning to her lover. "Captain Jadby can explain," replied Shepworth suavely. "And may I suggest," said Prelice politely, "that in explaining Captain Jadby might remember that there are two ladies present." The buccaneer shrugged his shoulders and pointedly turned his back on Prelice, a rudeness which that young gentleman noted carefully, intending to rebuke Jadby later for the same. "You are, I understand, Miss Trent, engaged to Mr. Shepworth," he said to Mona insolently. She glanced at Shepworth, but kept her temper. "Everyone knows that news. It is common property." "And I love you," he went on steadily. "Rather a public place to speak like that to me, Captain Jadby." "I am true to you, and he," pointing to Shepworth, "is false. He loves another woman." "And I forbid you to mention that woman's name," cried Shepworth meaningly. "Then you admit it," cried the sailor triumphantly. "He does," said Mona unexpectedly, "because I know it." "What?" Jadby recoiled in dismay. His thunderbolt had fallen, and failed. "My engagement," pursued Miss Trent, "is merely official." Chapter 16 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. Dr. Horace intervenes. In the dead silence which followed Mona's enigmatic announcement, a pin could have been heard to drop. Prelice's head was whirling. Here, at last, was the explanation, and he would now know the true relationship between the girl he loved and Ned, who apparently cared nothing for her. Shepworth stood quietly beside Miss Trent with a perfectly calm face, but his eyes were fixed threateningly on Captain Jadby, who appeared to be much amazed at the calm way in which Mona received his news. Lady Sophia glanced from one man to the other, and having a shrewd idea of what was coming, made up her mind to depart, so as to spare herself a scene, and Shepworth an awkward explanation. "Most interesting," she said, rising and shaking out her skirts, "but I have so much to do that I really cannot wait. Mona, child, you must come and see me at Folkestone, the Piccadilly Hotel, you know, though why Piccadilly by the seaside I really don't know." "Will you not wait and hear what I have to say?" asked Jadby, who seemed desirous of having as many listeners as possible, so as to cast shame upon Shepworth. "No, my good man," rejoined Lady Sophia, with all the polished insolence of a grande dame. "Other people's affairs do not interest me. You had better go back to the South Seas, where I am sure you will be much more at home. Prelice, help me on with my dust cloak." She pointed to a gray silk mantle which her dutiful nephew duly adjusted on her shoulders. Now, Mona, child, don't forget. Good-bye, Mr. Shepworth. Prelice, you had better come with me," she ended, sailing towards the door. The young man hesitated, and looked at Mona doubtfully. She interpreted his look promptly. "Lord Prelice will stay at my request." "My dear," Lady Sophia at the door sunk her voice, "so very awkward, if you really know what that creature," so she designed Jadby, "is going to say." "It has to be said sooner or later," whispered Mona, "and I want Lord Prelice to hear." "Oh!" A new thought seemed to strike Lady Sophia. She glanced from her hostess to her nephew, and then pursed up her lips, guessing in a flash what was coming. "You had better come with me, Prelice," she repeated, raising her voice, and at the sound of it Mona shrank away. But Prelice looked dogged and declined to come. "I must stop and support Miss Trent," he said. "Mr. Shepworth can do that," cried Captain Jadby, insolently. "He can," said the barrister, taking a step forward, "and he can support the cause of," with emphasis, "any lady." The advocate of the Stone Age, standing at the open door, raised her lorgnette and surveyed the group. "Most interesting," she said with cool impertinence. "Quite a comedy. Let us hope that it will not merge into a tragedy." And biting her lip, she departed, with a glare at her obstinate nephew. Guessing that Lady Sophia was offended, and pretty certain of the reason, Mona did not dare to follow. The motor car of Lady Sophia was heard whirling down the avenue in the hot sunshine, and only when the sound died away did Miss Trent return to the three men. "What more have you to say, Captain Jadby?" she asked politely. "It seems to me that there is little need of an explanation," he answered, with another shrug, and compressing his lips. "None at all that I can see," rejoined Shepworth in a cool voice. "I think Captain Jadby had better go." "Not until I receive Mona's answer from her own lips," he snarled, and looked a very ugly customer in his impotent wrath. "Miss Trent to you," said the girl, equably. "Mona, Mona!" vociferated the captain. "I have a double right to call you by your Christian name." "I did not even know that you had a single right," she retorted. "I have. Sir Oliver wished us to marry." "Quite so, and for that reason I became engaged to Mr. Shepworth." Prelice gave a gasp, and turned to his friend. Ned nodded. "It is true, Dory," said the barrister. "When I was stopping here during the lifetime of Sir Oliver, this man," he indicated Captain Jadby with contempt, "pestered Miss Trent with his attentions. Sir Oliver was on his side, why I can't say, but—" "I can tell you now," interrupted Jadby hoarsely. "I am Sir Oliver's son, and Mona is my cousin." There was a second silence. "I don't believe it," said Prelice decidedly, and his opinion was echoed by Miss Trent and Shepworth. Jadby threw back his handsome head scornfully. "It matters little what you believe," he said violently, "since what I say is the truth, and no denial can make it anything else. My mother was the daughter of a great chief of Tahiti." "Oh!" broke in Prelice impulsively. "Then you are a half caste." "Yes," admitted the captain, his nostrils working and his native origin becoming more and more apparent as he lost his temper. "My father was married to my mother in native fashion, but that, I learn, does not entitle me to inherit my father's title and property, which it should do. However, my father made a will in my favor before leaving the South Seas. He never had much love for me, and therefore I dreaded lest he should change his mind and leave his property to someone else. I came to England to look after my interests, and then learned that a new will had been made leaving the money to Mona. My father, to give him his due, was ashamed of himself, and proposed that the affairs should be settled by marriage, so that both Mona and I should benefit. I loved her, and agreed to the arrangement, but she scorned me, and so her uncle died," ended Prelice, looking sharply at the captain. Jadby whirled round furiously and stamped. "My father's death has nothing whatsoever to do with my engagement to Mona." "I never was engaged to you," she interposed swiftly. "It was because you persecuted me that I asked Ned to stand between us. I have known Ned for years, and he is a loyal gentleman." "Very loyal," sneered Jadby, with quivering lips. "To love one woman and become engaged to another." Shepworth would have spoken, but Mona prevented him. "There is no need for you to excuse yourself, Ned," she said coldly, and addressed herself to the fuming captain. "When I asked Mr. Shepworth to pretend to be engaged to me, so that your worrying might be stopped, he told me that he loved another woman. A woman who is—" Shepworth threw up his hand. "If you dare to say a word," he cried menacingly, "I shall break your neck." "There is no need," said Mona again, while Prelice, keenly observant, held his peace. "I can explain to Captain Jadby, and then he can go." "I have heard enough," said the sailor hoarsely, and glared. "To fool your uncle, my father," he added with emphasis, "and to fool me, you pretended to engage yourself to this man." "You have stated the position accurately," said Mona with great calmness. "Mr. Shepworth and I have paid you out. We have played a comedy by which you, for your insolence, have been deceived." "Mona!" The man took a step forward, imploringly. Miss Trent receded. "I am not afraid of you now," she declared in a clear voice, "although you did your best to frighten me, and I do not allow anyone to call me Mona save those I love. You may be my cousin for all I know, but I don't like you, and I shall have nothing to do with you. My fictitious engagement with Mr. Shepworth is at an end," she concluded, slipping off a ring and passing it to Ned, who put it in his pocket. "And you, I understand, have the property, since the will in my favor has been destroyed. There is no more to be said." "There is this to be said," shouted Jadby, the veins on his forehead swelling dangerously, "that this house is mine, and you shall leave it." Mona faced him coolly. "Mr. Martaban looks after my interest," she declared, quite composed. "As soon as he tells me to leave I shall do so. But until then I am mistress here, and I order you to go." Jadby would have disobeyed, as he was furious at the failure of his two thunderbolts. He had hoped to overwhelm Mona by stating that he was her cousin, and he had hoped to separate her from Shepworth by telling of the latter's infatuation for Mrs. Dolly Rover. Having failed, he looked like a fool, and would have tried to recover his ground by insisting upon remaining, but that Prelice rose to his feet and Shepworth took a step forward. Jadby was no coward, for the drop of white blood in him came from a brave old stock. But the odds were too great. Moreover, he really and truly loved his cousin, and his soul was torn within him at the thought of losing her. With a sudden revulsion of feeling, the tears sprang to his dark eyes, although he was by no means a tearful individual. Putting out his hands blindly, he groped his way to the door. Mona's generous heart smote her when she saw the man brought thus low, and she sprang forward to lay her hand on his arm. "Do not go in anger, Felix," she pleaded, using his Christian name, as Sir Oliver had often done. "If you are my cousin, and I believe that you have spoken the truth, let us part in peace. Shake hands." Jadby dashed the tears from his eyes and her hand from his arm. Her appeal brought back the original devil to his semi-civilized heart fiercer than ever. "Will you be my wife?" he demanded savagely. "No, I cannot." "Do you love any one else?" Mona drew herself up, quivering. "You have no right to ask that." "Perhaps not," raged the captain with contempt, "because you love a man who is in love with a married woman and—" Shepworth ran forward, his face white and his eyes bright. "Silence!" he exclaimed, and took Jadby by the shoulders. "I shall not be silent!" shrieked the half caste, becoming feminine and abusive in his towering passion. "You and your Mrs. Rover, who—" What else could he have said neither Mona nor Prelice knew, for the barrister, becoming suddenly silent after the manner of the angered white man, ran Jadby swiftly out of the room. The semi-Polynesian kicked and shrieked and swore, and even tried to bite, but Shepworth, with set teeth and grim eyes, forced him along the hall and out of the front door. The next moment Jadby was lying on his back some distance away, with Shepworth blocking the door of the house, he claimed. "You devil!" yelled the half caste, and he leaped up to slip his hand behind him. The barrister flung himself down, while 3 shots rang out from the captain's derringer, then sprang to his feet on hearing no more. Apparently only 3 chambers had been loaded, for Shepworth, filled with wrath at this treachery, dared the worst and ran blindly down the steps. Jadby flung away the still smoking weapon with an oath and sped down the avenue as though the fiend himself was after him. For some little distance Shepworth followed, until he lost him on the wide downs, and then returned to the Grange to meet Prelice coming down the avenue at top speed. "Are you hurt, Ned?" shouted his friend. "One of the bullets ripped my arm, but it's nothing to speak of," was Shepworth's reply. "Where's Mona?" "She ran upstairs to see Mrs. Blexley. I'll send up and let her know that you are all right." "I say, Ned, you have made a dangerous enemy." "Oh, damn the danger!" growled Shepworth, who was furious. "The low, mean, sulking hound! He insulted me before on account of Constance, and that was why we fought. He hadn't a revolver then, and I gave him a black eye, the brute!" "And are you really in love with Constance?" asked Prelice doubtfully. "Yes," said Ned gruffly, and not seemingly inclined to talk about the matter just then. "I'll tell you all about it some day. Meanwhile let us reassure Mona and get my arm bathed. It's only a scratch." "But one moment, Ned," said Prelice, holding him back from entering the house. "You are not actually engaged to Mona? I mean Miss Trent?" "No, I only agreed so as to save her from Jadby's insolence and Sir Oliver's persecution." "Then Miss Trent is heart whole?" "Entirely, so far as I know," replied Shepworth dryly. And then, wheeling to face his friend, "Why do you ask these questions?" "I'll tell you all about it some day," said Prelice, echoing the former speech of the barrister. "Hallo, there's Mona, that is, Miss Trent herself." It was indeed Mona who appeared at the top of the steps with Mrs. Blexley and 2 footmen behind her. She looked pale and hurried forward. "Are you hurt, Ned?" she asked anxiously. "I heard the shots." "It's only a flea bite," said Ned quickly. "Don't bother about it. I'll go to my room and bathe it." "Let me do that, sir," said Mrs. Blexley, and Shepworth, nodding a faint assent, for he had lost some blood, went into the house and up the wide oaken stairs. Prelice lingered behind with Mona. "I am so glad," he said meaningly. "That Ned has been shot? How cruel of you!" "No, no, no. You must be aware that I am glad because—" "I haven't time to listen now," said Mona, her face crimson and her eyes very bright. "I have to send a telegram." "To whom?" demanded Prelice as she disappeared through the hall. "To Dr. Horace." came back the reply. And then the young man, in addition to his other puzzled thoughts, had this new one concerning his former fellow traveler. "I wonder what she wants with Horace?" he asked himself. The answer came at dinner, when Mona was in the safe presence of Ned, and Prelice could make no demonstration of the feelings he had for her, feelings which she had guessed long since existed. Shepworth's wound, which was worse than he admitted, had been bound up, and he was in very good spirits. Mona, startled by the events of the afternoon, looked pale, and was rather restless. But Prelice said nothing. In the first place, he could not in the presence of a third party, even though that party was his school chum, and in the second, he was too happy to speak much. All he could do, and did do, was to fill his eyes and heart with the pale beauty of Mona Chant. After all, the gods had been very good to him by removing an apparently impassable barrier. It was Shepworth who asked why Mona had sent the wire to Dr. Horace, and Prelice listened with great interest to her reply. "After the case," explained the girl, more to Martaban than to the young men, "Dr. Horace sent and congratulated me on the verdict. Also he wrote a note saying that if Jadby proved dangerous, those were his words, that I was to wire to him, and he would draw Jadby's teeth. His own words again, Mr. Martaban." "Do you know Dr. Horace?" asked the solicitor, looking puzzled. "No, I never set eyes on him until he stepped into the witness box to give evidence about the herb. But when I heard the shots, I knew then that Captain Jadby was becoming dangerous, so I sent off a telegram to Dr. Horace. Just before dinner a reply came." "And the reply?" asked Shepworth, also puzzled. "Dr. Horace will be here by 10 o'clock tonight." Prelice stared. It must be something very important to bring Horace down so promptly. "Have you any idea of what he means?" "No," replied Mona quietly. "All I know I have told you. But if this Dr. Horace can stop Felix from shooting people, it will be as wise to have him down." "Felix!" muttered Prelice discontentedly. Mona shot a smiling glance at him, not ill pleased to see how openly jealous he was, even though he had no official right to be so. "He is my cousin, you know," she said sweetly. "I don't believe it," said Shepworth sharply. "I do, and if you will look at Uncle Oliver's portrait up there," she turned to point at the wall, "you will see that there is a likeness between him and Felix. Only Felix is darker," finished Mona. Prelice did not argue, but sat restlessly in his seat. When Mona left the three men over their wine, they had a long discussion concerning the present aspect of things, and formed a committee of three to decide what was best to be done. Lord Prelice insisted upon going up to London for an interview with Madame Marie, while Shepworth was equally certain that the trail of Jadby ought to be followed. As to Mr. Martaban, he openly bewailed the loss of the will, which would have placed Mona in possession of the Landwin property. As the dinner was late, the three men lingered for a considerable time, talking of what was best to be done, and the stable clock struck 10 before they were aware of the passing of time. At once Prelice jumped up and walked into the drawing-room. There, to his surprise, he found Dr. Horace, more shaggy and uncouth than ever, sitting comfortably beside Mona Chant. The two looked like Titania and Bottom the Weaver. "How on earth did you come here?" asked Prelice, amazed. "Walked," retorted Horace gruffly. "I caught an earlier train, and so got here before the time mentioned in my wire. Good evening, Shepworth. So you've been killed, eh?" "Oh, I'm alive yet," laughed the barrister. And then Dr. Horace was introduced to Mr. Martaban, to whom he immediately addressed himself. "I'm glad that you are here," he said in his usual growling tones. "I mean you, sir, the land shark." I've some business for you." "Is this the time to talk business?" said Mordaunt, somewhat annoyed, as after a good dinner he did not feel able to give advice. "Judge for yourself," said Horace, fishing a blue envelope, foolscap size, out of the breast pocket of his shabby coat. "Look at that." Mordaunt did so, and so did Prelice and Shepworth. Peering over the shoulder of his dress coat, Mordaunt uttered a cry of amazement. "Why, it's the missing will!" he almost shouted. Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. The old story. On hearing Mordaunt's surprised cry, everyone stood still and silent out of sheer amazement. The unexpected had happened with a vengeance, and Dr. Horace, quite delighted with the sensation that he had produced, rubbed his hairy hands with a grim chuckle. "Quite dramatic, isn't it?" said Horace. Mordaunt drew a long breath, and clutched the document, as though he feared that it would vanish into thin air, like Macbeth's witches. "I am surprised," he confessed, staring at the doctor. "How did you become possessed of this, sir?" And in asking that very pertinent question he anticipated the speech of the others. Horace did not answer immediately. Without requesting permission, he produced his immense German pipe, already stuffed as full as it would hold with strong tobacco, and lighted it calmly. Prelice looked annoyed at this breach of good manners, and would have stepped forward to remind Horace that he was not in his native wilds, but that Mona, guessing his intention, made a little gesture to stop him. Seeing what Dr. Horace had done, she was prepared to forgive him everything. Besides, the great traveler was such an eccentric person that no one could be angry when he behaved like a bear. It seemed natural that he should. Meanwhile the lawyer, becoming impatient, repeated his query. "How did I become possessed of it?" said Horace, lying back luxuriously and puffing out white clouds of smoke. "Well, I might say that I murdered Lanwin, mightn't I?" "Yes, you might," remarked Mona, smiling, "but you did not." "No," sighed Horace, with an odd expression on his large face. "It would be an anticlimax." "Oh, hang your dramatic instincts," said Prelice crossly. "Why can't you answer the question?" "I am about to, if you will hold your tongue and sit down. You always did have too much chin music, Prelice. Well," he looked round with a grin, like a somewhat malicious monkey, "if you must know, I got that will from Agstone." Mona dropped back into the seat whence she had risen, and her example was followed by the three men. Horace's calm announcement took their several breaths away, and their individual legs could support them no longer. "It seems to me," cried Prelice, much annoyed, "that you are presuming on our credulity." "No, I am telling you the truth." "But did you know Agstone?" demanded Shepworth, staring. "Oh, yes, he was my brother." What?" quacked Mordaunt like an excited duck. "Go slow, old son of a gun," said the doctor, smoking calmly. "I told Lord Prelice yonder of my relationship, and there is no need for me to explain the same to you, beyond stating the fact that Steve Agstone was my brother. He knew of my address in London, and came to see me on the day after the murder." "Why didn't you give him in charge?" asked the lawyer. Horace surveyed the red face turned towards him in an aggravatingly calm way. "For two reasons," he grunted. "Firstly, Agstone was my brother, and dog doesn't eat dog. Secondly, I had no reason to believe that he had anything to do with the death." "But the knife which he brought to Mr. Shepworth's flat—" "Oh, yes." Horace glanced at the two young men and chuckled. "But you see there was no mention of the knife when Steve came to see me. Still, I must admit that he feared lest he should be accused of the crime." "Oh!" cried Mona, sitting bolt upright. "Then he did not accuse me again?" "Not to me," answered the doctor promptly. "In fact, Steve seemed to be rather friendly inclined towards you." "No, no, no!" cried Mona earnestly. "He never liked me. He was jealous because my uncle loved me." "Well," Horace looked at his pipe rather than at the speaker, "I should not say that if I were you. In my opinion Steve was not so very devoted to Lanwin as was made out. But I thought—" "Never mind what you thought," said Horace rudely, and rose to walk up and down the room. "I am here to tell you facts. When I have explained as much as is possible for me to explain, I'm going." "Won't you stop here for the night?" asked Mona, surprised. "No," retorted Horace abruptly, "I won't. Now listen, as my time is valuable, and I can't remain here chattering nonsense and behaving rudely," finished Prelice with sarcasm. "Oh, you're there, my son, with your monkey brand manners. There, there," he went on teasingly as Prelice jumped up, flushing. "Don't get out your little gun. There's a lady present." "I wish you would remember that." "Oh, so I do. There's a lady present who wishes to hear how I became possessed of a document which gives her 10,000 a year. Very good. Don't interrupt, or—" Horace broke off with a gruff laugh. "What bad manners you civilized people have." Prelice looked despairingly at Shepworth. It seemed impossible to bring this uncouth person to the point. But Mona was laughing at the bear-like antics of the traveler, although Mr. Martaban's indignant face showed how his feelings were outraged. "This," cried the lawyer, "is quite intolerable." "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" crowed Horace derisively, then unexpectedly whirled a chair round between his stumpy legs and sat down, leaning his arms over the back, to address his audience as if it were from an imaginary pulpit. "Listen," said Horace gravely, and the smiles gave place to watchfulness on every face. "My brother came to see me on the day after the murder. I had already read of Lanwin's death in the papers, and asked Steve how his master came by his end. Steve swore that he did not know, but stated that he quite expected to be accused. He then lugged that blue envelope which Mr. Martaban is holding out of his pocket and passed it along to me. Before I could open the envelope he was out of the house, and I never heard of him again until Prelice yonder brought me the report of his death in Shepworth's flat. When alone I opened the envelope and found the will." "Why didn't you bring it forward at once?" fumed the lawyer. "Because I thought that its production might implicate Steve, and I didn't wish to have Steve hanged for a crime which he did not commit." "Are you sure that he did not?" asked Shepworth meaningly. "One is sure of nothing in this old ramshackle world," said Horace philosophically. "But what I want you all to understand is that Steve told me nothing. Why he should bring me the will I can't say, and he did not wait to tell me how he became possessed of it. I should have brought it forward at the trial, but that the papers hinted at the burning of this will being a point in Miss Chint's favor. I therefore waited until Miss Chint was acquitted, and resolved only to use the will when Jadby, whom I don't like, tried to secure this property. Miss Chint sent me the wire tonight, saying that Jadby was making himself disagreeable, so I came down with the will. You have it, Mr. Landshark," he added, looking at Martaban. "So that is a present for you, Miss Chint." He pulled out a small white paper packet from his breast pocket and flung it dexterously across the room. "You will find that useful should Captain Jadby prove to be troublesome, as he will now that he has lost the money. That is all my mission here." He jumped away from his chair unexpectedly and trotted to the door, where he turned to survey the company. "Good night." "Stop! Stop!" cried Mona, running to the door, through which he had so promptly vanished, and the others following echoed her urgent cry. But by the time they reached the hall the door was wide open, and Horace had disappeared as completely as though the earth had swallowed him up. Beyond was the darkness, which veiled him. "Is he mad?" asked Mona, turning an amazed face to the three men. "Mad or not, he has done you a service," said Mordaunt, looking down at the will which he still held. "This is undoubtedly your uncle's last testament, which was not burnt. It is signed by Sir Oliver in the presence of Stephen Agstone and Emma Bleksley. What a facer this will be for our South Sea friend," ended the lawyer, actually becoming slangy in his delight. "Ought we follow Horace?" Shepworth asked. "No," replied Prelice, who was frowning at Horace's manners. "Even if we caught up with him, he would say nothing. We must wait to see if he will again intervene in the case." "He seems to have washed his hands of it," said Ned, sauntering back to the drawing-room. "He did so before, yet when Miss Trent wired he came down. I wonder—" Prelice paused and bit his fingers. "You wonder what?" "If Horace killed Sir Oliver and Agstone." Shepworth stared. "That's a rotten bad shot, Dory. Why should he?" "Oh, I can assign no reason, but—" "My dear old chap, it is absurd. I know you are thinking of the will being brought here by Horace, but why should not his story be a true one, since Agstone is his brother?" "Well," Prelice threw out his hands with a despairing gesture, "I can't understand the whole business. It passes my powers of comprehension." Before Ned could reply, Mona summoned both the young men. Along with Mordaunt, she had been opening the parcel which Horace had thrown across the room, and was now exclaiming at its contents. "Ned! Lord Prelice! Here is the sacred herb!" They hurried over to have a look, and there sure enough was the yellowish stalk of the herb from Easter Island, bearing 7 or more purple leaves. In addition, there was a written paper, which Mona read aloud. "Use the enclosed when Jadby comes to close quarters and makes himself unpleasant," she read in a bewildered manner. "Also, it will be as well for you to use your power over Lord Prelice to prevent his searching further in this case. If he meddles with what does not concern him, it means sorrow and perhaps a public scandal." There was a dead silence. "Now what does that mean?" asked Mona. No one knew, no one dared to suggest an explanation. Prelice was the first to speak. "I advise you, Miss Trent, to obey Horace, and keep this herb constantly in your pocket. He is not the man to give a warning without some grave reason. He has saved you once from Jadby, and this herb, as he plainly says, intimates that it will save you again." "But why should—" "Oh," Prelice shrugged his shoulders, "I can explain nothing, and with your leave I shall go back to hide. Ned?" "I remain here for the night," replied the barrister. "All right, I shall see you in the morning," and Prelice sauntered to the door, after bowing to Miss Trent. He did not dare to take her hand, for fear he should never let go of it again, but she hurried after him and spoke anxiously in the hall as he put on his light summer overcoat. This hasty departure annoyed her, as she showed plainly. "Why will you not remain and talk over this strange matter?" she asked. "No, no," answered the young man, averting his eyes and quickly opening the door himself, since no footman was at hand. But if you will permit me, I shall come here at 5 in the morning." "At 5? Why at 5?" "Then is the breaking of a new day," whispered Prelice in a somewhat tremulous voice. "And in the gardens, in the light of the dawn, you can then say, you can then say—" He repeated the phrase, raised his eyes to meet hers, and left with a hurried good night. Mona stood where she was, amazed and confused. What did he mean? She asked herself, and immediately her heart explained. A light broke over her lovely face, and she whispered to herself, "At 5, in the gardens, in the light of the dawn." Meanwhile Prelice rushed downward to hide through the darkness of the night. There was no moon, but the purple sky scintillated gloriously with stars. A warm wind, laden with the fragrance of wild flowers, was blowing with strange murmurings over the bare spaces of the downs, and the young man's spirits thrilled to the beauty and peace of the night. He should have thought of the case, of Horace's queer warning, repeated for the third time, and of the behavior of Captain Jadby, now converted from a secret foe into an open enemy. But he considered nothing of these pressing matters which had to do with the everyday world. Rather did he think of Mona and her starry beauty. Rather did he recall with joy the great truth, which he could scarcely realize, that he was free to woo her, without being disloyal to his bosom friend. Mona was not engaged to Ned. Her heart was free to receive a loving occupant, and Prelice, striding through the leafy lanes, swore inly that he would be that occupant. Lady Sophia would be hostile. He knew that from the way in which she had taken leave of the girl. But what did that matter, so long as Mona received him at dawn, in the enchanted gardens of the secluded Grange? All that night Prelice slept soundly. As a lover, the tumult of his heart should have kept him wide awake, but the transcendental heights to which his thoughts raised him so drew him away from earthly matters that he lost consciousness of physical surroundings. Lying on his bed, the sound of the breaking waves on the rugged beach below the hotel lulled him to sleep. And then his spirit soared to a higher world, spiritual and pure, in which there was no pain or sorrow or weary misunderstandings. When he awoke, with the rosy lights of sunrise streaming through the curtainless window, his spirit told him little of what it had seen in the superphysical world. But Prelice was conscious that somewhere in the vast spaces of the unknown he had met with Mona, and had talked with her for endless periods of time. True, according to the clock, he had slept but a few hours, but living in eternity as a true lover should, he took no count of earthly time. Man's measure of the eternal. He had lived for thousands of years during the dark hours, kneeling at the feet of Mona, crowned queen of dreams, of kisses, and now he was to see her again in the flesh, gracious and lovely, and, as he knew she would be, truly kind. The spirit of the man, having bathed in the fountain of sleep, rose therefrom pure and undefiled. It seemed meet to Prelice, although he was not usually so imaginative, that he should wear a suit of pure white as symbolic of the coming interview. And as he passed uphill, clothed in spotless flannels, with the purity of the dawn stealing into his soul, he felt as though he had been reborn into a fairer and more perfect world. Passing swiftly over the grassy uplands, his eager feet bore him down into the hollow, through the ancient woods, and on to the bird-haunted lawn. And there, in the cold, searching, chaste light of the dawn hours, he beheld his lady standing amidst the dewy grass, waiting for his coming, and she also was clothed in white. As Prelice came across the lawns, his eyes far off met those of Mona, which shone like twin stars in the rosy flushing of her face. According to the precedent, he should have raised his hat. He should have greeted her with a handshake. He should have explained his desire for this unconventional meeting. But he did none of these things, neither did she desire that he should do them. Without a word, without a pause, he came to her swiftly and clasped her in his arms. Their lips met in one long kiss, and the awakened birds sang joyfully in the rustling trees. So might Adam have greeted Eve in paradise when God presented him with the helpmate who was to be the mother of all mankind. "And you knew all the time," murmured Mona on his breast. "No, I did not know. More shame to me. I really thought that you were engaged to Ned." "I don't mean that. But surely you knew. You guessed that I loved you, and you only." "No. How could I when I showed my love in 100 ways," she said, with a playful laugh. "Oh, Lord Prelice, how very little you know of women." "I know more than is good for me," he murmured, smiling. "What?" "That is, Lord Prelice does," he protested, hedging. "But George is an innocent boy who knows nothing." "Who is George?" "I am," and he kissed her again, victoriously. Mona laughed happily. "I am afraid that George is not so innocent as he makes himself out to be." "Teach him to be good, my darling. A hard task you set me, George." She lingered lovingly over the name. "And oh, what you must think of me, who take so much for granted." "I think that you are an angel," he cried fervently. "Dear, I loved you from the moment I saw you in that cruel court." "And I loved you," she whispered. "I thought that it was merely friendship until we met again. And then I knew." She gave him a delighted little crow of laughter which stirred the young man's heart to its depths. Impulsively he dropped on his knees and kissed her hands alternately, scarcely able to speak. "I am not worthy of you," he muttered. "Dear," she stooped and raised him to her breast, "let me find out your imperfections by myself." "I have many," he said humbly, "and I love you for them. I marry a man in the world of men, and not an archangel, in the same way as you take a faulty woman and not a spirit of light. But we are spirits, although clothed in coats of skin," she ended gently, "and when the hour strikes we shall know each other. Do we not know each other now?" "No. That is, Mona Chant knows George Prelice." The young man jumped gaily to his feet. "Enough for the day is the delight thereof," he cried. "I am quite content to know Mona Chant until she becomes Mona Prelice. When will you marry me?" "So like a man," laughed the girl. "You wish to settle an important future in 5 minutes. We must wait." "Wait? Oh, no, no! Why should we?" "Because," Mona laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, "your wife must be like Caesar's, above suspicion." "You wish me, then, to go on looking into the case?" "I do, unless you accept the warning of Dr. Horace." Prelice threw his Panama over the hedge. "I accept no warning, since you make me strong to dare it. I shall go on with the case. Tomorrow." "Why tomorrow? Oh, Mona, let me enjoy paradise for 24 hours." "No, you must act, and at once, lest we lose our paradise altogether. I don't understand what Dr. Horace means, but in spite of his hints I wish you to look into matters in order to find out who murdered poor Uncle Oliver, and in order to clear my name. You must go up to London to day and begin your search. It is a sacrifice I ask of you, no doubt, but then love, true love, means sacrifice." "Very good," said Prelice sedatively. "I shall go up by the midday train and interview Madame Marie Epengrave." "Why her particularly?" "She gave the herb to your uncle. Mrs. Blexley mistrusts her. Now," he closed her mouth with a kiss, "not a word more. The gates of Paradise will close in a few hours. Until then—" "Yes, yes. Until then—" "Let us play at being Adam and Eve in a garden." And they did. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Power of the Herb. It had been Prelice's intention to ask Ned about his love for Constance Rover before leaving the Grange, but on second thought he resolved to wait until he learned more concerning the murders before putting Shepworth in the witness box. Nevertheless, he was somewhat upset to think that his best friend was entangling himself with a married woman. Prelice was no prude, and had not been a Sir Galahad himself. All the same, he did not think that Ned was acting rightly. Of course, the case was a hard one, since the two truly loved one another. Constance had been sacrificed on the family altar, and to a man who took advantage of her sacrifice to play the tyrant as much as he dared. The poor woman was very unhappy, and it was to be presumed that the man who loved her was unhappy also. It said a great deal for Shepworth and Mrs. Rover that they had not long ago defied conventionality and eloped. Since they had not gone this length, Prelice argued that they were trying to bear their several burdens as honorably as possible. But how long would such endurance last? According to Shepworth himself, Mona knew of his love for Constance, since he had explained the same when the pretended engagement was made to save the girl from Jadby's wooing and Sir Oliver's persecution. But Prelice, in the first flush of his love, shrank from questioning her about so distasteful a subject, and on her side, Mona was loyally silent until Ned chose to speak. Thus it came about that, although Prelice met his friend at breakfast, he made no remark about this very private business, and Shepworth did not volunteer an explanation. Rather did the conversation turn on the unexpected appearance of the lost will, and Martaban explained his future actions. These included an immediate journey to London with Mrs. Blexley, who had to make an affidavit as to the authenticity of the document. Under these circumstances, as Shepworth could scarcely remain at the Grange when both Martaban and the housekeeper were absent, he arranged to go to London with them by the 10 o'clock train. Prelice would fain have lingered in those delicious gardens with Mona, but as he knew her views, he kept to his determination. However, when the trio drove away to Hyde, Prelice had a golden hour or so all to himself, and very wisely made the most of it. It was with great regret that he took his way to the station at Hyde and to the train which was to bear him miles away from his goddess. But the memory of the last kiss which she gave him cheered his somewhat despondent mood all the way to Charing Cross, and on stepping on to the platform of the Metropolitan Station, Prelice shook off his dreams and addressed himself to the task in hand. As the day was fine, and Prelice, as usual, felt the need of exercise to tame his exuberant spirits, which had quite recovered during the journey, he walked to New Bond Street, and somewhere about 3 o'clock found himself reading a brass plate inscribed Madame Marie Epengrave, and afterwards he entered a narrow and dark passage to mount a steep flight of stairs, and finally came to the second floor of the building where the fortune teller received clients. A dark-complected lad of 14, dressed in white robes with a blue scarf round his waist, received the newcomer and informed him that Madame Marie was engaged for 10 minutes or so. Prelice therefore sat down, and glanced over some papers lying on a round table. These mostly dealt with occult matters up to date, and he speedily grew tired of reading much which he could not understand. The room was small and commonplace, and even ugly in its adornments. The table aforesaid, a few cane chairs, and an old horsehair sofa completed the furnishings, and 2 dingy, uncurtained windows overlooked Bond Street. There was nothing of the mystical about this very ordinary apartment, and Prelice concluded that Madame Marie certainly did not spend her earnings on magical frippery in order to impress those who called upon her. After a glance round, he spoke to the lad, who was seated cross-legged at the door, and asked him if he was a Hindu. "No," answered the boy in very good English, and with a flash of snow-white teeth. "I come from the South Seas." "Indeed!" answered Prelice in his turn, and somewhat astonished. "Has your mistress been in the South Seas?" "Yes, sir. She brought me from Tahiti, but I want to go back again." Prelice reflected. Tahiti was the home of Captain Jadby, and the former haunt of Sir Oliver Landwin. He wondered if Madame Marie had met the baronet there, but the lad was not likely to know that, so he asked him another question. "Does your mistress know Captain Felix Jadby?" The effect on the boy was somewhat strange. He leaped to his feet and muttered some words in his native tongue, which apparently were not complimentary to the captain, judging from the savage expression of his face. "Madame does know him," he said at length, "and he comes to see her here very often. I don't like him. He kicked me. I would kill him if I were in Tahiti, but here—" The boy shrugged his shoulders to show that the English law was much too particular. "Madame loves the captain and wants to marry him," went on the boy, apparently so carried away by his hate that he said more than was wise, considering his dependent position. "But he loves another, and—" Here the sound of the inner door opening made the lad aware of his folly in speaking secrets to a stranger. He cringed, and caught Prelice's hand. "You will say nothing to her?" he implored. "No, no," Prelice assured him, and slipped half a crown into his hand. "But later you must tell me more. I also dislike Captain Jadby." "I'll tell you what I can to harm him," said the boy viciously. "He kicked me and struck me, the son of a chief. But don't tell her," he added, pointing with a trembling hand to the inner door. "Oh, my soul, don't tell her, for she can send the spirits to torment me." The young man promised again, thinking that the lad in a way was somewhat like Caliban in his fear of spirits, and looked upon Madame Marie as a sort of female Prospero, who could have him pinched black and blue. But he had little time to think about this new ally, who might be of assistance in undermining Jadby's schemes, for a lady, fashionably dressed and holding a handkerchief to her face, emerged from the inner room. The lad showed her out, and Prelice waited for his reception. A silver bell sounded within, and the boy returned to point meaningly at the door, laying his finger on his lips in token of silence. Prelice nodded reassuringly and stepped into the shrine. If the approach to this holy of holies was commonplace, the shrine itself certainly was not. Prelice beheld a room of no great size, furnished very oddly. That is to say, it was not furnished in the ordinary acceptation of the word. The ceiling was painted a dull red, and a plain carpet of the same hue was spread over the floor. 2 windows looking on to Bond Street were filled in with painted glass, representing various mystical signs, and the four walls were hung with lusterless black stuff, which made the place look like a chapel during a funeral service. But the odd thing was that the red carpet was strewn with perfectly white cushions, and there was neither table nor chair. Tall pillars of black marble stood in the four corners, each bearing a glass ball on its summit, and between the windows was placed a bronze tripod, in which smoked a perfumed fire. What with the dim religious light, the black walls, the red carpet, and the snowy cushions of silk, Prelice felt somewhat dizzy. All this theatrical parade was evidently designed to produce a confusing effect, and unseat as much as possible the reason and judgment of Madame's dupes. Annoyed that he should give way so easily, the young man pulled his wits together and looked at the priestess who had conceived this artful mise-en-scene. Madame Marie, clothed in a long white silk robe, made perfectly plain, knelt, Japanese fashion, on a cushion in front of the tripod, and with her back to the painted windows. She was a stout, heavy-looking woman of apparently no great height, with a colorless face, very large and smooth, and with masses of snowy silvery hair, which tumbled down her back in waves of white. What her figure might be Prelice could not judge because of the robe, but he noted that her hands were slender and beautiful, and also ringless. Indeed, she did not wear a single ornament of any description, and kneeling perfectly motionless with closed eyes, looked like an idol carved out of alabaster. It was cleverly done, and Prelice, the skeptical, could quite understand how the majority of people yielded to the carefully prepared spells of this managing woman. But it was when Madame Marie opened her eyes that Prelice became aware of the true secret of her power over weaker minds. These were large and blue and clear, looking from under white eyebrows in a penetrating way, fathomless as the sea and as mysterious. Prelice met this mystical gaze calmly, but felt his skin prickling and his willpower growing weak. Aware that the seeress was trying to hypnotize him, as she doubtless hypnotized her other clients, the young man concentrated his will to meet and baffle hers. For some time they stared at one another, Prelice looking down from his height, and Madame Marie gazing upward from her cushion. Then the woman closed her eyes again with a somewhat annoyed expression. "You are not a weak man," she said in a deep, melodious voice, like the sound of a mellow bell. "No," answered Prelice calmly, "I am not," and he sat down cross-legged on a cushion directly in front of the Sibyl. "Then why do you come to me?" she asked, looking at him steadily. "Only weak persons wish to know the future. The man who is strong and self-willed and skeptical, as you are, need learn nothing of the future, which lies in his own hands." "In the hands of God, rather," corrected Prelice. "Do you know who I am?" "You are Lord Prelice." "How do you know?" "I might say by magic, but you would not believe that. I always suit myself to the nature of those I meet. Therefore I shall give a commonplace explanation. I saw you in court when you gave evidence during the trial of Miss Trent for murder." Prelice nodded. "I might have guessed that. Do you know why I have come?" Madame Marie folded her hands calmly before her, and replied equally calmly, "You have come to solve the secret of the murders." "That is a very clever guess, and I rather think that you can solve the secret, madam." "Why should you think so?" she asked, with absolute calmness. "You gave the sacred herb to Sir Oliver." "I did, the sacred herb of Easter Island, but I need not explain to you, since you heard what Dr. Horace said in court. The herb induces trances, and Sir Oliver wished to go into a trance by its aid. I therefore gave him a few twigs." "Why did Sir Oliver wish to go into a trance?" "He desired to explore the astral plane, if you understand that." "I quite understand. I have studied theosophy. Well?" "There is nothing more to be said," rejoined Madame Marie, with a little shrug which hinted at French blood. "He went into a trance, and while his spirit was absent from his body he was murdered." "Who by?" "I can't tell you. Even with my powers, and they are great, I am not permitted to know who killed Sir Oliver Landwyn. It was his karma, and he had to bear it, since he reaped only as he sowed. The karma of his murderer has nothing to do with me. Therefore my sight is veiled, and I cannot read the truth. And if I could," added the woman with emphasis, "you must be aware, if you have studied the occult, that I would not be permitted to tell without permission from those who rule." "The lords of Karma?" asked Prelice, wondering if she was talking in earnest, or merely wiggling out of an awkward position. Madame Marie bowed solemnly. "I see you understand somewhat, but may I ask you to be more open with me regarding the purpose of your visit? You can hardly have come to accuse me of these crimes." "No," said Prelice, studying her face carefully. "I think that you are innocent. Let us leave the murders alone for the moment. I want you to help me." He paused to add effect to his next words. "With Captain Felix Jadby." The woman's hands moved restlessly, and she began to lose her calmness when the name was pronounced. "I know nothing about Captain Jadby, beyond the fact that I met him at Landwyn Grange. But he is not guilty of Sir Oliver's death, if that is what you mean." "Oh, dear me, that is not what I mean at all," rejoined Prelice in his most airy manner, and resolving to be very plain. "But the fact is that Captain Jadby is my rival." Madame Marie rose as though moved by a spring, and he then saw that she was little, but tremendously dignified. "Your rival!" she repeated, and her marble white face became crimson with angry blood. At length he had managed to break through her calculated calm. "I understood that Miss Trent was engaged to Mr. Shepworth." "Oh, the whole world knows that," replied Prelice, still airy in his manner. "But that was merely an official engagement to prevent Jadby from worrying Miss Trent. Sir Oliver was in favor of the engagement with Jadby, for reasons—" "I know those reasons. I know that Felix—" she let slip the name, forgetting that she had disclaimed intimacy, "that Felix is his son." "His illegitimate son," said Prelice with emphasis. "Yes, by the daughter of a chief to whom he was married in native fashion, Lord Prelice. Of course, Captain Jadby," she had the name stiffly by this time, remembering her slip, "came home to look after his interests, and wished to marry another woman, forgetting," cried Madame Marie, beginning to pace the room, "that he was engaged to marry another woman. Myself, Lord Prelice, myself." Remembering what the native boy had said, Prelice expressed no surprise, but rapidly resolved to work on her jealousy. "I congratulate Captain Jadby more than I do you," he remarked gravely. "Oh, I know he is not a good man," she cried, now quite the woman, and kicking several cushions out of the way. "But I loved him. I have always loved him, and he owes much to me. He promised, when we met in South Seas, that he would make me his wife. Not that I am young or beautiful, but because he found in me, so he said, a good comrade. I gave him the money to come home and see his father and to secure his inheritance, if possible. But he saw that girl and loved her. Oh, how I hate that girl who stole his heart!" "You need not," said Prelice very dryly. "Miss Trent dislikes Jadby immensely, and pretended to be engaged to Shepworth so as to escape his clutches. Otherwise, Sir Oliver might have worried her into consenting to a marriage which she hated. But Jadby came down the other evening to Lanwin Grange, and knows now that the engagement was a false one. What he does not know," ended Prelice emphatically, "is that Miss Trent is now engaged to me." "To you?" Madame Marie stopped in sheer surprise, then went on pacing the room, talking half to herself. "But why should I be astonished? I saw her look at you in court. I noted how you glanced in her direction. I told Jadby that you loved her, and that she loved you." "Oh, you couldn't be certain," cried Prelice, blushing. "I have occult powers which enable me to read hearts," said Madame Marie coldly. "Believe or disbelieve, as you like." "I shall believe if you will read my heart now." "There is no need of my exercising occult powers for that," she replied, waving her beautiful hands. "You wish to learn the truth about the murders so that Miss Trent's name may be cleared and Felix thwarted." "Yes," said Prelice coolly, "you are right. And you can help me to clear Miss Trent's name, to discover the truth as I can help you to marry Jadby." "How can you do that?" "By marrying Miss Trent myself." Madame Marie nodded, and thought, pressing her hands to her head. "I can help you by the power of the herb," she said rapidly. "Listen. I shall go into a trance induced by the herb. Do whatever I say, but do not attempt to awaken me. Simply listen to what I say, and then leave the room. I shall send my spirit to seek out the truth. But first," she said, slipping down on the cushion again, "tell me how much you know." Prelice saw no objection in being thus clear, even if Madame Marie wished to work against him, and seeing that her love for Jadby was at stake, he did not think that she would. All that he told her would do little to harm his own schemes. He therefore made no demur, but detailed everything from the time Lady Sophia had first drawn him into the case by sending him to the New Bailey. Madame Marie listened intently, nodding at intervals. "It is useless for Felix to strive," she said when he ended, and with an air of triumph. "The fate of yourself is mingled with that of the girl. You love so speedily now because you loved before in previous incarnations. Her karma is your karma. Felix can never marry her, nor can Mr. Shepworth marry her, even if he did not love Mrs. Rover." "Pardon me?" cried Prelice quickly. "I made no mention of Mrs. Rover beyond the fact that she wore the green domino and the scarlet embroidered dress. And she, as I explained, is innocent. You have no right to talk of Mr. Shepworth's love for a married woman." "Lord Prelice," said Madame Marie quietly, and moved towards the wall, "my knowledge of these affairs is greater than you imagine. Mrs. Rover has consulted me, and Felix learned, how it matters not, that she loved Mr. Shepworth. However, we can talk of these things another time. I will go into a trance and search the Alexander Mansions for what I can find. Only, as I said, after I have spoken and have become silent, leave this room at once. In due time I shall come out of the trance when the power of the herb is exhausted." Prelice nodded in silence, and Madame Marie, drawing aside a portion of the black hangings, revealed a small recess. From this she took some purple leaves, and moving towards the tripod, threw them on the perfumed fire. "Lie down on your face," she commanded, "else the fumes will send you into a trance. Quick! The smoke rises." It certainly did, in a thick white cloud. Madame Marie stood over it, letting the odor flow into her nostrils, not wishing to experience the power of the herb as he had witnessed its results before. Prelice lay full length on the red carpet. The smoke was circling so high up that he could not breathe it, although a sickly whiff of tuberose perfume came to his nostrils. Perhaps the draught sweeping under the door neutralized the power sent at this lower level, but be this as it may, Prelice lay perfectly flat, and as in a dream heard Madame Marie speak after the manner of the tranced, in an unemotional voice and very distinctly. "I leave this room," she said in her mellow tones. "I rise high. I pass across London. The streets are under me. I see the park. And now I poise above Alexander Mansions. I sink. I pass through the roof. I am in Mrs. Rover's flat." "Search for the dress," commanded Prelice softly. There was a pause, and then the calm voice sounded again. "I search in Mrs. Rover's room. The dress she wore is there in a wardrobe together with a green domino." "Search for another dress," said Prelice, risking the chance. "Another dress of the same style." Again there came a pause. "I am searching," said the voice, and a silence ensued. For quite 2 minutes it endured. Then Madame spoke again, still with the same awful calmness. "A man's dressing room, in the flat, across the landing. I see a cupboard, in which many clothes are hanging up. Men's clothes they are. Behind them is a green domino, with a scarlet embroidered dress sewn to it." "Who wore it?" asked Prelice, his heart beating. "I cannot tell. It is not permitted by the powers." Then came a long silence. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Circumstantial evidence. It was with extraordinary feelings that Lord Prelice emerged from that mystic room into the everyday world of Bond Street. After the refusal to declare the name of the person who had worn the dress, Madame Marie had become silent, and Prelice raised his head to see her standing rigid and white between the painted windows. The white smoke had disappeared into thin air, and save that the strong tuberose scent still lingered behind, there was nothing to show what had placed her in the trance. Obedient to instructions, the young man left the still figure in the lonely room and passed through the outer apartment on his way down the stairs. The boy, cross-legged in the corner, looked up anxiously as he went out. "You have said nothing?" he breathed apprehensively. "Nothing," answered Prelice softly, and descended the stairs. When he stood in the street again he removed his hat, and drew a long breath of the smoky London air. Impure as it was, it dispelled the slight dizziness which the odor of the sacred herb had produced. Then the young man chartered a hansom to reach his rooms in Half Moon Street. But not until he was in his very own den, and seated in an armchair with a brandy and soda within reach, did he find time to reflect. His reflections were considerably aided by a first-class cigar. "A queer adventure," thought Prelice meditatively. "What am I to do next, I should like to know?" Of course the answer to this was obvious. He should go at once to Alexander Mansions, and learn if what Madame Marie said was correct. A very difficult errand to go upon, Prelice thought, as it would be hard to induce Mrs. Rover to explore her husband's dressing room in search of evidence which might bring him into trouble. And what excuse could he make, without telling the whole truth? Then again, Mrs. Rover might scoff at Madame Marie's astounding statement, made under such astounding conditions. Yet, on reflection, Prelice did not think that she would scoff, considering that she had consulted the fortune-teller herself, and believed in the occult. There was a considerable vein of what the vulgar call superstition in Constance Rover. That the dress was there, Prelice had not the least doubt. Of course, on the face of it, an ordinary mortal would laugh at the idea of evidence being procured in such a way, but Prelice had traveled too widely, and he had seen too much to make him a skeptic. In Cairo, in the West Indies, in South America, and in the South Seas, he had witnessed occult ceremonies and doings which proved clearly the existence of that unseen world at which many people laugh and of which all people are afraid. Drink, drugs, music, rapid movement, and even absolute stillness are all aids to open the psychic senses, as Prelice knew very well. Madame Marie had used the fumes of the sacred herb to rend the spirit from the body, and he quite believed that she had gone to Alexander Mansions to make the strange discovery. When she woke from the trance she would be, according to psychic laws, quite unconscious of what she had said. But here Lord Prelice began to doubt. Madame Marie had admitted that she knew more than Prelice imagined. Seeing that she had been at the Grange during the tragedy and was closely connected with Jadby, it seemed very probable that she was aware of much which was necessary to learn before the actual truth could be made manifest. So far as Prelice could judge, and he was a shrewd reader of character, the fortune-teller was entirely honest in her dealings with him. If she wished to gain Jadby as her husband, it was necessary that she should be so, since only by the marriage of Lord Prelice could the girl whom the buccaneer loved be removed from her path. It was not worth her while to play Prelice false, since his aims and hers were identical. Prelice desired to marry Mona, and Madame Marie wished this also. She was anxious to make the sailor her husband, and Prelice was quite willing that this should be so, since it would put an end to Jadby's troubling, and might perhaps take him out of England. Therefore Prelice believed in Madame Marie Epengrave. He credited her powers also, for she had the true eyes of one who can see into the astral world. But he could not be certain if she had used her occult powers on this occasion. She may have known beforehand of the dress, and might merely have used the trance as a means of communicating it without arousing Jadby's wrath. If the dress was found, and evidence therefrom was forthcoming likely to solve the mystery of Agstone's death, the captain, wishing to keep Mona in uneasy terror for her reputation, would be much annoyed. But then Madame Marie could explain that she had only gone into a trance for Prelice as an ordinary client, and was unaware of what she said. Under these circumstances the buccaneer could say nothing. "Well," said Prelice, stretching himself, and talking aloud, a habit which he had contracted when traveling in silent places, "it's rum business altogether. If the dress is in Dolly Rover's wardrobe, what then? I can't accuse him, as he certainly had no reason to kill Agstone. Humph! I wonder if this is what Horace meant when he said that I would be sorry if I searched further into the case. I certainly don't want Dolly to be hanged, but if he were, I am quite sure that Ned would console the widow. Ugh!" Prelice shivered. What a horrible thought! Rover is a bounder and a blighter and a cad, but I honestly don't think that he is a criminal of this sort. I don't believe that he has the plunk, for one thing, and for another, he had no motive. He reflected. I'd best get along and see Constance. On glancing at his watch, Prelice learned that it was 5:30, and concluded that probably Mrs. Rover would be at home sipping tea, after the manner of women worn out with shopping. He decided to give her half an hour and then catch the 7 train from Charing Cross to Hyde. Come what might, the young man intended to get back to Hyde that night in order to walk over and see Mona. He assured himself that she would be anxious and would wish to learn how he had sped. But he might as well have confessed the truth to himself, namely that he pined hungrily for the sight of her face, and that every moment passed away from her side was spent in the outer darkness. "Where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth," said Prelice to himself, quite ready to wail and gnash if he missed his train. As fate would have it, Mrs. Rover was at home, and came forward to greet her friend in a wonderful tea gown which suited her queenly figure. The rose-hued blinds were down, and the room looked like the grotto of the Venusberg. But in spite of these softening aids, Mrs. Rover appeared somewhat haggard. Nor was her greeting of Prelice very friendly. Indeed, it was so harsh that he congratulated himself on finding her alone. But then, had anyone else been present, she would have been all smiles and gentle words. "How dare you come and see me after leaving as you did last time?" was Mrs. Rover's polite salutation. "And I know why you went, too. Yes, you may look and look, Lord Prelice, but I know. I explained your conduct to Ned, and he told me how he had described the dress to you." "Which means?" asked Prelice, calmly and unflinchingly. "Means?" she cried in stormy tones. "It means that you believed me to be the woman who came in and waved the bronze cup under Ned's nose." "I did believe it for 1 minute," confessed her friend, making a clean breast of it in view of what was coming. "But of course, on reflection, I saw how ridiculous it was to suspect you." "It was! It was! It was!" retorted Mrs. Rover, sitting down and tapping her foot. "I have not many friends, Lord Prelice, but I did think that Dory was one of them." "Dory is," he assured her. "A fair weather friend! Pooh! To suspect me!" she went on angrily. "Me of all people! As if I would have hurt Ned! Had it been that Chint girl, you might have had some cause." "Speak gently about Miss Chint," said Prelice quietly. "I shan't. Why should I?" "Because I am engaged to her." "You?" Mrs. Rover started to her feet in delighted amazement. "But Ned—" "Ned's engagement was merely an official one to prevent Jebby—" "Oh, yes, yes, I know all about that. But I didn't believe that Ned was speaking the truth. I thought that he was throwing me over for that horrid girl. No, no, don't look at me like that. She isn't a horrid girl now that she is engaged to you. I shall love Lady Prelice much more than I loved Mona Chint. Engaged! Engaged!" Mrs. Rover made a ball of her handkerchief and tossed it in the air. "What a rage Lady Sophia will be in!" "She is in it already," said Prelice dryly. "I don't care." "Of course you don't. You're a man. A man! Oh, how I love a man! Not that my married life gives me any experience," she ended bitterly. "Constance," said Prelice seriously, "sit down and let us talk quietly about your married life." "I don't wish to talk of it," she retorted, but nevertheless took the seat he pointed to. "You must. I am your friend, as you very truly say. I admit it now that you are engaged to Mona. But I say, Dory, yes, I'll call you Dory now. I say, isn't it rather sudden? You have only known her a week or two." "It was a case of love at first sight," said the young man very earnestly. "Pooh, pooh! I don't believe in such a thing." "I didn't either until I experienced the sensation. But I really did love Mona from the moment I saw her in the dock, and it was only honor which held me back from speaking even earlier." "Honor? What honor?" asked Mrs. Rover contemptuously. "She was supposed to be engaged to Ned, you know. Only when I learned that the engagement meant nothing was I able to speak out." "You have very many scruples," said Mrs. Rover with a shrug, and evidently forgot that all is fair in love and war. "That's a purely feminine view, Constance. Had Ned really been in love with Mona, and really engaged to her, I should have left England without saying a word." "So like a man," retorted Constance scornfully. "Why, if a dozen women loved Ned, I shouldn't give him up." "Constance, you forget that you are married." "I don't. Dolly never gives me a chance of forgetting." "Constance!" Prelice spoke sharply. "You are a foolish, headstrong woman. Do you want to be disgraced?" "There is no chance of that," cried Mrs. Rover in a fury. "How dare you talk to me like that?" "Because I see you going headlong to ruin." "You see nothing of the sort. I am a loyal wife to Dolly. Ned knows that I love him now as I loved him before my marriage. And you know, Dory, as he does, how my marriage came about." "I know, but you ought to make the best of it." "I am making the best of it," cried Constance, rising to stamp her foot in a royal rage. "There is not a breath of scandal against my name. No one can couple my name and Ned's together. We scarcely ever meet, but we can't prevent our feelings." "Still," urged Prelice, in a rather futile manner, "since you have elected to become Mrs. Rover, you must consider your husband." "Let him consider me first. I made a bargain with him, and he accepted, knowing that I love Ned and not him. He has broken that bargain in the meanest manner, and my father died of sheer worry through the breaking of it. Now I have to stifle my deep love for Ned and act the part of a loving wife. I feel like a hypocrite." "I don't think you need, Constance. People say that you treat Rover badly. It is as well that you should know." "I do know. I have heard that before. But Dolly himself put that story about. I don't love him, and I don't pretend to. But I am as obedient and kind as I can be. I told you that I treated him like a dog. So I do, like a pet dog. A dog that is fed up and smoothed and cosseted and given cream and meat and all the things poodle dogs like. But Dolly goes about posing as a husband that is badly treated. He does not dare to say that I have deceived him, however," she added, drawing a deep breath. "He would suffer for it if he did. Miserable as I am, I abide by the bargain which he broke." "But what is to be the end of it?" "I don't know. I don't know," wailed Mrs. Rover, pacing the room, and holding her hands to her head. "I really believe that Dolly wants to see me disgraced. He took these flats above Ned's in spite of my protestations. I want him to go away, but he won't." "Oh," said Prelice thoughtfully, "so Mr. Rover took these flats above Ned's, did he? Purposely?" "I don't know." Constance paused, looking startled. "Why do you ask?" Lord Prelice considered. "Constance, I want you to do me a favor." "Yes." Mrs. Rover spoke softly and with an effort. "Do you think that your husband wishes to get Ned into trouble?" Constance put her hand to her head. "He hates Ned," she said at last in a strained voice, "because he knows that Ned loves me and I do Ned. But for all his jealous watching, he cannot find anything wrong between Ned and myself, because," she added, drawing herself up to her full height, "there is nothing wrong and never will be." "You have not answered my question," repeated Prelice quietly. "Do you think that Rover wishes to get Ned into trouble?" "Yes. I believe that he would be glad to see him dead." Well then, Constance, answer me another question. Would you like to see your husband get into trouble?" "No," she said, with a startled air. "Dolly is a fool and cruel, and I can scarcely endure him. All the same, I don't wish him any harm." "That is all right," said Prelice, rising. "Then I can trust you to hold your tongue?" "About what? Why are you so mysterious?" "My poor girl, I would rather hold my peace than tell you what I am about to tell, but it is necessary that you should know. If I do not move in the matter, someone else, less friendly to you and Rover, may do so, and then only God knows what would happen." "Dory!" Constance caught his hand and passed her tongue over her dry lips slowly. "What do you mean? I have gone through so much that I am quite able to face the worst." "You won't scream?" "No, I'm not a fool. Oh, what is it?" she blazed out with a stamp, clenching her hands and clenching her teeth also. Prelist raised his hand. "I must tell you as best I can," he said in a peremptory tone which quietened her. "After all, I may be mistaken. Is that dress you wore at the ball in your room?" For answer Constance pressed the bell button, and when the footman appeared, gave an order. "Tell my maid to bring me the frock and domino I wore at the ball, at the masked ball," she said, then faced Prelice when the man went out. "Are you about to accuse me?" "No, don't ask questions, Constance. I am sorry to keep you in suspense, but I can't help it. The whole thing is so extraordinary." "What thing? What thing?" But Prelice, perhaps mistakenly, would not tell her. The maid entered with the domino and dress, which Prelice at once recognized as the masked ball costume. He simply cast one glance at it, and then, "You can tell her to take it away again," he remarked. Mrs. Rover did so wonderingly, and waited to hear what he had to say next. "Take me to your husband's dressing room in the other flat." "What for?" she asked. "And how do you know that Dolly's dressing room is in the other flat?" "Never mind. Take me there," said Prelice impatiently. He wished to get the things over as speedily as possible, as he saw how strung up she was, and yet, until he was certain, how could he accuse Rover? In his heart of hearts, Lord Prelice wished that he might be spared the disagreeable task of accusing Rover at all. But if he did not do so, it was not improbable that Jadby, to further his own ends, might intervene, and it was much better that Jadby, at all costs, should be kept out of the business, since he was not likely to spare either Constance or her husband. "Come, come," cried Prelice impatiently, and seeing that she did not move, "take me to your husband's dressing room." And Constance led him thither like a woman in a dream. They left one flat and crossed the landing to the other. When in the dressing room, which was luxuriously furnished, Mrs. Rover remained silent and observant at the door, while her friend examined the sanctum of her husband. So mysterious were his words and movements that she began to wish that she had not admitted him, since she did not desire to harm Dolly, objectionable as she found him. But if she could not trust Dory in all ways, who could she trust? Meanwhile, Prelice peered into a wardrobe, and shook out the many suits it contained. He searched a large wooden press, wherein shirts and underlinen and handkerchiefs and collars were neatly laid out. But in each case he failed to find that for which he hunted, and drew a long breath of relief. Perhaps, after all, Madame Marie was wrong, in spite of the magical powers to which she had laid claim. When at his wits' end, Prelice turned to Constance. "Isn't there a cupboard?" he asked. "Over there," she said, pointing to the hither side of the fireplace. "You must be blind not to see it." "Oh, it is unlocked," she added, noting that he hesitated. "Dolly has no secrets. There is nothing in it but old clothes and rubbish which Trimmer," this was Mr. Rover's valet, "stows there. Look into the cupboard by all means." The young man made no reply to the sarcasm, but opened the cupboard of Bluebeard. It was deep and wide, with many pegs at the back and round the sides, upon which hung many clothes, out of date and slightly worn. On the floor was a heterogeneous pile of shabby slippers, discarded boots, sundry medicine bottles, tin boxes of polish, and many odds and ends, showing that this was a bag-o'-rags receptacle for sheer rubbish. Prelice speedily pulled out all the clothes and threw them on the floor, while Mrs. Rover shrugged and stared at his zeal. Suddenly he came upon a green silk domino, inside which was sewn the front of a white dress, streaked with thin lines of red velvet. The whole made one garment, easy to slip on and off, which when worn would look both like a dress and a domino. This very ingenious garb was hidden behind the discarded clothes, which apparently had not been disturbed for some considerable time, and only by removing all, as Prelice had done, could the domino and its clever fixings have been discovered. "There," said the young man, holding it up for Mrs. Rover's inspection. With staring eyes Mrs. Rover drew near, and handled the fabric. "An imitation of the frock and domino I wore at my ball," she gasped, then added after a pause, "A woman never wore this." "Ned said that the person who waved the bronze cup under his nose to make him insensible was a woman," said Prelice significantly. "Oh!" gasped Constance, taking his meaning at once. "Dolly? It's a lie!" End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Sacred Herb by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Rover explains. "It's a lie," repeated Constance, seeing that Prelice did not say a word. "Dolly is a little cruel fool, who tyrannizes to the full extent of his weak powers. But I don't believe that he killed Agstone." "Well," drawled Prelice reflectively, "on the face of it there appears to be no reason, and yet this sham frock is in this rubbish cupboard." "Dolly can explain," breathed Mrs. Rover hopefully. "Can he explain why he entered Ned's flat to—" "He didn't! He didn't! It's impossible, I tell you." "Constance," declared the other seriously, "you said yourself that Mr. Rover would be glad to see Ned dead, out of sheer jealousy. I quite believe that, and I believe also that he had not the pluck to kill him. But he did his best to get Ned into trouble." "By killing Agstone? What rubbish!" cried Mrs. Rover feverishly. "If he killed the one, he would have murdered the other, and would have chosen Ned in preference." "Humph! Perhaps with a refinement of cruelty Rover wished Ned to be hanged, and so slaughtered Agstone in the hope that Ned would be accused. And accused Ned would have been," cried Prelice decisively, "but that I brought in your guest to see him helpless." Mrs. Rover twisted her hands in her hair. "It's impossible, I tell you," she lamented, hoping against hope. "Dolly is a fool. He never would be a murderer. He hasn't the plunk. Heaven knows that I have no cause to love him, and that he stands in the way of my happiness. But I tell you, Dory, that I would have cut off my right hand sooner than have brought you in here to spy out his shame." "I am glad to hear you say that, Constance," returned Prelice quietly, "for it shows that you have honor, if not love, and that, even to secure your happiness with Ned, you will not stoop to injure the man who is your husband. But think, my dear girl, is it not better that I should find this than Jadby?" "Jadby? The man who loves Mona? What has he got to do with it?" "Everything," said Prelice tersely. "He wishes to secure Mona as his wife, and will stop at nothing. You may wonder how I came to guess that your husband's dressing room was in this flat, and how I came to know that this sham dress was hidden behind these clothes. I can explain very shortly. I consulted Madame Marie Epengrave." "That fortune teller?" gasped Constance, staring. "I have consulted her myself, and she told me a lot of rubbish. Surely you do not believe what she says in that shoddy room of hers?" "I am bound to believe," said Prelice dryly, "seeing that the domino with the attached frock front is here, as she stated. But she may not have told me so by means of occult power, in spite of her claim to exercise the same. In some earthly way, I know not how, she knew where this," he touched the domino, "was to be found. She will tell Captain Jadby, to whom she is much attached, and then he will come here to make what trouble he can. Therefore you can understand that it is better for Rover that I should be the discoverer." "Yes, I see," murmured Constance, and tottered towards a chair to fall into it. "Oh, horrible, horrible! But there must be some explanation, Dory. Think of one! Think of one!" Women, as Prelice reflected at the moment, were most extraordinary. Here was a wife who avowedly hated a husband of the trickery, effeminate sort, yet when chance placed a weapon against him in her hand, she refused to use it, despite the temptation of thus ridding herself forever of a marital incubus. Rover had practically killed her father. He had cheated her into a match which she loathed, and he was doing his best to make her unhappy. In the face of it all, his deceived wife defended him, and this against the strong desire which she had for the man who truly loved her. Truly, women were strange. However, it was not Prelice's business to analyze Mrs. Rover's feelings. What he had to do was to learn the meaning of Rover's hiding the domino in his cupboard, and this he proceeded to do. "Was Jadby at your ball?" he asked abruptly. "I never asked him. I don't know him," she replied, clasping her hands tightly. "But you know that owing to the masks, many people, shady people too, were there. Captain Jadby might have come also." "He did come," said Prelice quickly, "for he was one of the first to unmask when seeing Ned insensible, and to blame me. Certainly he may have come up the stairs opportunely, but since he wore a domino and mask, I am sure that he was at the ball." "What color was the domino?" "Blue, light blue," rejoined Prelice promptly. "There were many blue dominoes," murmured Constance. "I wonder why this man came to my ball?" "Ah, that is what we have to find out. But another question." Prelice cleared his throat. "Presuming, as we must, that your husband wore this made-up thing, did he know what you would wear?" "Yes," assented Mrs. Rover, then started up with a cry and a very pale face. "Oh, Dory, Dory, are you going to say that my dress was imitated by him, so that I might be accused?" "It looks like it," said Prelice reluctantly. "What else could he say?" "But I can't believe that Dolly would be so wicked," said the poor wife anxiously. "And yet the dress is the same. There is only a front, to be sure, but when worn anyone would have mistaken him for me. A man always looks taller in women's clothes." "These are hardly women's clothes." "Sufficiently like them to deceive anyone. But you said that you spoke to someone wearing a dress like mine. It was not me, Dory. I should have remembered. Was it Dolly?" "I never spoke to you or to anyone dressed like you," said Prelice quickly. "I only told you that to get at the truth. But I never expected to hear you say that you had worn the dress. One thing I may tell you," he added, "that the green domino seemed to be ubiquitous. I saw him, presuming your husband is the person, talking and drinking and dancing all over the place." "I was dancing also," said Constance. "And if Dolly wore a similar dress, it is natural that you should see the frock and domino often. Dolly received my guests unmasked, you know." "I remember, but later he vanished, and then might have—" Prelice touched the domino significantly. "Still, there is one thing to be said," he added. "How did your husband enter Ned's flat?" "Don't you remember?" she said, raising her head. "Agstone brought in the lady, Dolly, I suppose, when Ned was in that cataleptic state." "I forgot that. But who admitted Agstone? What is the matter?" He asked this because Constance rose suddenly to her feet with a cry of astonishment. "Mr. Hakin was at the ball," she said, alarmed. "I know. I saw him. That is, I recognized him by his chuckle. Well?" Mrs. Rover sat down again. "You know that Mr. Hakin is my godfather," she remarked, and when Prelice nodded, went on, "He was much distressed over my preference for Ned, seeing that I was married, and came to remonstrate with me on the night of the ball." "Hum," said Prelice coolly. "I wondered why he was at the ball. A most unusual festivity for a dry-as-dust old man like Uncle Simon to be at." "I gave him the key," said Constance, in a low voice. "The key? What key?" "The key of Ned's flat." "Constance, how did you become possessed of the key?" With a bent head and a hurried low voice, she explained. "Dolly was very cruel to me at times. He even struck me, and I could not strike back at a little rat like that. I told Ned, who was furious and wanted to frighten Dolly. I prevented him, so that there might be no scandal. Ned then gave me the key of his flat. He had an extra key, and told me if Dolly ever struck me again to come to him. I should not have thought of doing so, but to quieten Ned I consented to take the key." "What an injudicious thing to do!" breathed Prelice, alarmed. "If your husband knew, he might do a lot of damage. But how did Uncle Simon get the key out of you?" "I told him about it the night of the ball. He got me into a quiet corner to remonstrate, so I explained everything. Mr. Hakin was angry at Ned for having given me the key." "He was quite right," interposed Prelice. "Ned ought to have had more sense than to do such a mad thing. Go on." "Mr. Hakin insisted upon having the key, and then said that he would go down and see Ned." Prelice turned suddenly pale. Was this what Horace had warned him against when he advised him to leave the case alone? "Did Uncle Simon go?" he asked in a stifled voice. "I don't know. He certainly said that he would go down and give Ned back the key, and talk to him about his folly in letting me have it." Prelice felt uncomfortable, and his thoughts flew to his aunt with her merry ways. It would be terrible for Lady Sophia if Hakin were involved in this dreadful case, and indeed if he were, as seemed apparent from Constance's story, Prelice wished that he had taken the doctor's advice and had left it well alone. While he was puzzling over this new problem, and trying to find reasons against his uncle's complicity, he heard Constance cry out, and looked up to see Rover standing in the doorway. The little stockbroker, dressed to perfection, and overdressed at that, looked more dapper and neat than ever. His face was more colorless, his eyes more plaintive and blue, than they had been in the artificial light in which he had received his wife's guests. Such a mean-looking, bloodless man could scarcely get into a rage. Yet a venomous look crept into his eyes as he surveyed his wife and her visitor. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, trying to assume the dignity of an injured husband, which sat very badly on him. Before Constance could speak, Lord Prelice stepped forward with the domino over his arm and spread it out. "This is the meaning of my being in your dressing room, Mr. Rover," he said sharply and perfectly cool. "I found this behind some clothes in yonder cupboard." "How dare you search into my private affairs?" cried Dolly, standing on tiptoe and growing red. "Is it not better that I should do so than the police, Mr. Rover?" The little man looked genuinely puzzled. "The police? What do you mean by mentioning the police?" "This dress, this domino, both are an imitation of the dress and domino which your wife wore at the ball. And the lady who was introduced by Agstone to make Shepworth insensible, if you remember the case, was arrayed in this way." Instead of turning pale, Dolly became redder than ever, and turned like a snake on his wife. "You!" he said savagely. "You entered Shepworth's flat. You dared to—" "I never was near the flat," said Constance, coming very close to him and looking down contemptuously from her great height. "And if you dare to hint at such a thing, I shall leave you forever. I have put up with enough from you. Don't drive me too far." "Mr. Rover has enough to do to defend himself without troubling you, Constance," said Prelice quietly. Dolly started. "What do you mean?" he asked nervously. "This sham dress was hidden in your cupboard." "I never saw it before. I didn't know it was there," Dolly gasped, for he was beginning to scent danger. "The presumed woman introduced by Agstone was dressed in this," went on Lord Prelice mercilessly. "You hated Shepworth. You wished to get him into trouble, and so—" Prelice stopped. "I leave you to draw your own inferences," he ended. Dolly trembled, as well he might, for the visitor had drawn up a very good case against him. "I tell you I never saw the dress before," he quavered. "And how did you find it?" "That is neither here nor there," said Prelice, wishing to shield Constance from the mean wrath of the little man. "Later on the police can explain." "The police! The police!" Dolly grew as white as a sheet. Constance laid her hand on his shoulder. "Don't be afraid, Dolly. I do not believe that you killed that man Agstone." Dolly brushed her hand away with the snarl of a terrified cat. "Keep yourself to yourself," he snapped, showing his teeth. "You hate me, so you need not defend me." "I don't love you," answered Constance bitterly. "I have small cause to, considering the way in which you tricked me. All the same, I do not wish to see you get into trouble over a crime which I truly believe you had not pluck enough to commit." "You were quite right," retorted her husband shamelessly. "I never did have pluck enough to kill a fly, much less a human being. I should have stabbed your lover long ago if I had." "Shepworth is not Mrs. Rover's lover," said Prelice quietly. "He is. She is always howling after him," taunted the venomous little man. "But she sold herself to me, and—" "And you did not pay the price," said Constance, scornful and still. "No," Dolly chuckled. "I got the better of you there. But you are my wife now, and I'll make you pay. Shepworth can marry that criminal girl whenever he likes. I hope he will, so as to torment you." Mrs. Rover's eyes flashed. "Ned shall never marry—" she began, when Prelice made a sign to her to keep the secret of the new engagement, and spoke himself, coldly and sternly. "Miss Trent's character has been perfectly cleared by her acquittal, Mr. Rover, and if you dare say a word against her, I shall throw you out of the window." "How brave you are in defending Shepworth's bride," said Dolly, wincing at the flash in Prelice's blue eyes. "I am," replied the other, not contradicting the mistake under which he saw Dolly labored. "But as yet you have not proved your innocence." "There is no need to prove it." Rover's voice whimpered unsteadily. "It is ridiculous to accuse me." "This dress was hidden in your cupboard," insisted Prelice. "What of that? This room was used as a place for the coats and hats of the men who came to the ball. Any one of them might have hidden the domino and frock there. I did not. I received my guests unmasked, and afterwards put on a black silk domino." "Ah!" Prelice took a step forward. "Then it was you who appeared in Shepworth's dining room, and who gave the alarm." "Yes, it was me. I came down to see Shepworth, and to make it plain to him that he was not to make love any longer to my wife." "He never did make love since our marriage," flashed out Constance with scorn. "Ned has been true to honor, as I have been." Prelice raised a hand to stop a promising quarrel between the ill-matched couple. "Only you, Rover, knew what kind of dress your wife was to wear at the ball," he said judicially. "Only you could have had a similar one made, so as to get her into trouble, I expect." "Another person knew," cried Dolly, with a flash of triumph in his china blue eyes. "Yes, I asked Hakin to come to the ball to remonstrate with Constance about her love for Shepworth. He is godfather to Constance, as you know. I was aware that Constance would try to dodge Hakin, as she didn't want to be scolded, so I described her dress to him that there might be no mistake. Hakin was at the ball, Lord Prelice. Why don't you accuse him?" The young man sneered, although he felt distinctly nervous at the many proofs accumulating against his uncle. "Hakin had no reason to get Shepworth into trouble. You had." "Nothing would have pleased me better, but I should have stopped short of putting my neck into a noose, and I did. I tell you again that I don't know how that domino frock thing came to be in my cupboard, that I never entered Shepworth's flat, as I certainly could not do so without a key, and that I was the man in the black silk domino who gave the alarm. And when I entered the flat then, you had left the door open." All this explanation was perfectly natural, and Dolly gave it with such an air of truth that Prelice was reluctantly obliged to believe him. The young man threw the domino over his shoulder and moved to the door. "I shall take this with me," he said curtly. "And see the police?" asked Rover with twinkling eyes. "No, not at present." "Not at any time, if you value your uncle's liberty." "What do you mean?" Prelice faced round sharply. "I mean nothing, as I know nothing. But there is as much evidence against Hakin as against me, and if you accuse me, I shall accuse him. How will Lady Sophia like a scandal of that sort?" "Eh?" Prelice turned away without vouchsafing a reply. "I shall see you again, Constance," he said coldly. "You shall not see her until Shepworth marries Mona Chent," snapped the venomous little husband, "and I shall move heaven and earth to bring that about." "You will need to," retorted Prelice, remembering his engagement and thinking how angry Dolly would be when he learned the truth. "And let me tell you, Rover, that if you ill-treat your wife I shall make it my business to thrash you." Dolly drew back and snarled, but seemed distinctly afraid. Prelice, with a nod to the unhappy wife, passed from the room, and out of the flat. He felt distinctly nervous about Simon Hakin. Chapter 20